Going live in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good eve, I'm sorry, good morning. I'm Bernard Green, Chair of the Brookline Select Board, and this is our regular meeting for Tuesday, March 17, which is being held as a workshop session for us to get deep into some matters. It's very important. Our primary purpose is to have our first public discussion of the recommendation of the Expenditure and Revenue Study Committee with respect to a possible override. This is a preliminary discussion, followed by more detailed discussions on March 24th. And if we need to go further on March 31st. We have until March 31st at 11:59 p.m. to file our ballot question. So we may, be doing this, having this discussion for 3 meetings. We'll also be discussing the 2030 roadmap this morning, and this afternoon we'll be taking up the Chestnut Hill commercial park zoning matter. So let's get started, and the first item is a miscellaneous item, comments from the select board. Okay, seeing none. First miscellaneous question is approving a proclamation of recognition and congratulation to retired Brookline police officer Debbie Hatziel-Lefteritis on receiving the 2026 Black Excellence on the Hill Award. And Debbie Hatz, as we call her, is in the audience, and I'm going to read the proclamation and then give it to her. Whereas the Brookline Select Board rightfully honors those Brookline residents and town employees whose service, civic commitment, and leadership have been shining examples of public service that have enriched the lives of residents and enhanced the civic life of our town. And whereas Debbie Hatziel-Lefteritis has been a paradigm of those qualities and a true Brookline trailblazer, as a Brookline police officer for 16 years and her many years as a civic leader and model citizen in the town of Brookline. And whereas Debbie Hatz was nominated by Brookline State Representative Tommy Bottolo and selected by the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus as its 2026 Black Excellence on the Hill Award. And whereas the Brookline Select Board further acknowledges and thanks Debbie Hatz for her outstanding and sustained contributions to the town of Brookline as a longtime resident, police officer, and trailblazing civic leader, and specifically cites the following: being an outstanding product of the Brookline Public Schools, from kindergarten to her graduation from Brookline High School, where she excelled in multiple sports and was inducted into the Brookline Hall of Fame and became the first African-American member of the Hall of Fame board. Being a mother who raised 5 outstanding children, 2 of whom are Brookline firefighters and 1 of whom, Debbie Hatz, served as his legal guardian through high school. Being the police department's first Black female officer beginning in 1998 after graduating from the Norwood Police Academy, where she broke the women's bench press record and was the president of her academy class. Wow. Being a leader in Brookline's community policing strategy and working to divert youth from destructive behaviors and from the criminal justice system by teaching the drug abuse resistance education program for 8 years, and being a leader in the groundbreaking Brookline Roundtable program that brought together police with social workers, school administrators, probation officers, the courts, and nurses to discuss issues arising in the high school and to anticipate problems, to identify youth at risk, and to intervene to provide support, guidance, and redirection. Also serving as a school resource officer before that job was formally known as a school resource officer, and working in schools to develop relationships with students during good times so that she and other youth officers could intervene to prevent problems in the schools, provide role models and guidance when needed, and divert youth from the criminal justice system when possible. Being a tireless volunteer with youth athletic programs, serving as town meeting member for Precinct 15, being the president of the Friends of Laura Vanderson Park, serving as a member of the Park and Recreation Commission, being a member of Green Space Alliance, and driving the senior center's bus when the regular driver was not available. Now, therefore, in consideration of the foregoing, on this 17th day of March, 2026, the Brookline Select Board, on behalf of the residents of Brookline, congratulates Debbie Hatch for being nominated by State Representative Tommy Vitola and being selected by the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus as its 2026 Black Excellence on the Hill Award. And and I give you the proclamation signed by all 5 members of the select board. We were unanimous in our selection.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor to serve this town and I'll continue to do so to the best of my ability. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Actually, we need to vote on that.
Okay.
But all in favor of the proclamation to Debbie Hatch, please indicate by saying aye. John Van Scoyac.
Aye.
Paul Warren.
Aye.
David Perlman.
Aye.
Mike Rubenstein.
Aye.
And Chair votes aye. So it's official. Thank you.
so much.
Okay. Next, let's have our override discussion, review of the expenditure and revenue study committee's final report and recommendations. With members of the committee, discussion of potential override ballot questions, including structure and amount. And I want to start off by saying this morning's discussion will be the first of possibly 3 discussions the select board will have and will help us decide on an override for the May ballot and everything that goes with that. This will be an introductory session that I believe, yes, Sadaf's here, Sadaf Kazmi and other members of the committee will present the full 639-page recommendation of the Expenditure and Revenue Study Committee. I'm sure everyone has read, or at least you've read the important parts. And that's in our packet. There are important executive summaries for the overall report and for each of the subcommittees that we had that the select board and the public should focus their attention on. Those are the essential readings, but in addition, you may want to read selective appendices and other materials. If there's something that you want to look into in greater depth. After Sadaf's presentation, I'd like to get a sense of the select board's preliminary thoughts on what we should put on the ballot as preparation for next week's meeting and further deliberation. Among the things that we have to decide, and please add or correct me if you think that is necessary. Which of the options we want to use? The recommendation of the committee is option 3. And if we choose option 3, what is the amount of the second tier? Option 3, of course, is a tiered override approach. So we have to decide the amount of the second tier. And, we will receive from the schools a list and town list of cuts that would be required if the town were, or the voters were to select the lower or intermediate level in that tier, and that tiered override. If we choose option 3, we'll be front loaded only with town expenses, which is like option 1, or loaded for the entire amount of the override, which is basically option 2. Also have to decide whether we want to set a condition of the school committee committing to an MOU to address some of the issues raised by the school subcommittee, and or extending the MOU that we entered into in relation to the Clifton Lawson Allen reports, and the content of any MOU. So, with that sort of summary of where we're going or what we're going to be doing, I'd like to turn it over to Sadaf Kazmi.
Thanks, everybody. So actually Cliff is gonna kick it off.
Okay.
Several of us who are gonna present today. So.
Do you want to say the question?
Yeah. Thank you.
And Sadaf, if you want to, you can join the Zoom call, run the slides, you can share your screen and pop up.
Right, great.
Or we could run the slides for you.
Yeah, do you mind running the slides or
No, no.
otherwise we don't want to slow us down?
I'll join up to take the internet.
Do you have well, Carl is on it, so it seems just.
Okay, I see. All right, good. So Dick's on there and Janet should be on the line as well.
I just looked.
Yeah, so the four of us are planning to present, so not everybody's here, but the four of us would represent DNR. So this way around the front of this. Thank you. And while Charlie pulls that out, and like I said, Cliff is gonna kick us off. We did wanna summarize the findings because it is a long report. And obviously, we assume that this group has read at least some critical mass of that report, but we wanted to make sure that we lay the groundwork really for the public who's listening in on this discussion.
You ask, Ellen, if I can use it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. For public meetings, Cliff Brown, I was the advisory committee alternate member on the expenditures and revenue study committee. I'm gonna just kick us off a little bit. I'd like to start by thanking our colleagues who are not here to present today. Ruth Ellen Fitch, Sergio Modigliani, Jeff Rudolph, John Doggett, Mariah Braga, Jesse Hefter, Sarah Mockeder, and of course, Chair Green and John Van Stoyak were also here. I also want to express, I hope on behalf of everyone, deep appreciation and thanks to Town Administrator Carey and his staff, Melissa Goff, Charlie Young, Lincoln Heineman, Nicole Lima.
I'm on.
No, did she forget to mention you? And Braga, other members of town and school staff who provided wonderful support to the committee throughout the process. The agenda today, we're going to, as Scott said, discuss an overview of the major sections of the report, the background, why we're here, considerations on capacity to pay, our recommendations, and then brief summaries of the individual subcommittee reports. There were the subcommittees, as you can see, the schools, the town, and future, which was really a subcommittee that focused on things that the committee identified as possibilities for efficiencies and revenue enhancements, but that really would take more than the 3-year time frame that we're examining for potential. Next slide, please. Why are we here? Brookline has a structural deficit. Property taxes represent 73% of Brookline's revenues, and I'm just going to say that the amount, that percentage varies from 73 to 79%, depending upon what you put into your numerator and denominator. This is from a chart in the budget, looking at all revenues, including enterprises. Our tax growth, and not all those property taxes are subject to Prop 2.5, that includes debt exclusions, which are not subject to Prop 2.5. But those taxes that are subject to Prop 2.5 are of course statutorily restricted to an increase overall of 2.5%. At the same time, our expense growth is unrestricted. The market dictates what expenses are. In addition, we often have unfunded mandates from town meeting that create the budgetary pressures and collectively bargain contract terms that have embedded costs that exceed the growth in our revenues.
Cliff, can I
Yes,
just make
please.
one point? Could you just for the public explain what an unfunded mandate is?
Sure.
Tell me that, and give an example.
So an unfunded mandate is, in town meeting, is the town's legislature and ultimately has control over the budget. And, we hold town meeting twice a year. And at any one of those meetings, the members of town meeting, who are elected, representatives, volunteer representatives, can determine that they have an interest in adding a program or a requirement. They could change the bylaws. And some of those votes, if they're implemented, have costs associated with them. And so town meeting passes those new ideas or regulations, but they are not in a position to be able to raise money to pay for them. And town meeting generally doesn't take the step of saying, okay, this is what it's gonna cost. Let's move funds from over here to over here. So they create an unbalanced situation in the budget. That helpful?
Perfect, thank you.
Now, Brookline isn't alone in facing fiscal challenges. Many municipalities across the state are. Why? Because in recent years, as we all know, inflation has been above historical norms. Health insurance premiums have increased dramatically and are forecasted to continue increasing at least for the next few years. And we have unfunded pension and OPEB, that's other post-employment benefits, mainly retiree healthcare costs that we are funding. And the state requires our pension obligations to be funded by 2040. Brookline is on a path to fully fund those by 2030. And the current policy is to take the sums that are funding the pension liability, and if we do reach full funding, to then direct those to the OPEB liabilities, which are significant and growing. So within this difficult framework, there have been several efforts made by both the town and the schools to deal with fiscal pressures in both sides of the ledger, if you will. Are looking at, even with an override, reductions of staff. Town is looking at 5 full-time employee reductions, full-time equivalents. And the schools are looking at 22.1 full-time equivalents, even with an override. Despite that, the 3-year forecasted structural deficit totals just under 26 million, roughly 8 of that from the town and roughly 18 from the schools. It's a fairly significant amount of money that we're trying to deal with or gap. This chart shows everyone how that structural deficit plays out over the next 3 years. I'm not going to take a lot of time going through numbers on charts, but am obviously willing to come back if anyone has questions about any of the information in a chart. Okay, I'm now going to pass it off to Dick Benka, who is at home recovering from surgery, and he's going to discuss the capacity to pay.
Thank you very much, Cliff. Dick Benka, I'm a town meeting member in Precinct 14, former select board member, and was a member of the schools subcommittee of the ENRSC. There's a good deal more in the capacity to pay section of the ENRSC report, but I'm going to just focus on a couple of salient points here. Looking at housing costs in Brookline, the accepted measure of housing cost burden is housing costs that are greater than 30% of household income. The data that we have is from the American Community Survey. They do estimates and calculations. We have the most recent 2024 American Community Survey data. Taxes affect both owners and renters. Owners obviously directly, renters through the tax pass-through in a standard rental agreement. The bottom line is that over a quarter of owners are paying more than 30% of their household income for housing. And an even larger percentage of senior owners are paying more than 30% of their household income for housing. Many of those are paying more than 35%. There's a small portion between 30 and 35%. Most are over 35%. That's over 3,000 owners and over 1,000 senior owners who are in that housing cost burden category. Among renters, the impact is even greater. There are over renters paying more than 30% of their house.
We're losing him.
Dick, could you turn off your video? We're losing you.
49.9%, essentially 50%, 1,000 of senior renters are paying more than 30% of their household income for housing. I just have a notice that are we okay?
Yes, you're okay now.
Thank you. Did you miss anything?
Maybe we had a little blip in there, but I think the point got across.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Let me just turn to the other point, which is taxes in Brookline. This is looking at fiscal 15 to fiscal 26. This information is based on the assessor's annual tax classification hearings, rapidly escalating taxes on all types of properties in Brookline, far outstripping the rate of inflation. And as we know, taxes are a cost element that are highly visible to voters, both in the annual tax bills that owners get and in the rent escalators that renters would get. Taxes on the median condominium, whereas area inflation during this period went up about 37%, taxes on the median condominium up 53%, two-family 85%, three-family and four-plus family 78%, and single-family 97%. In dollar terms, the numbers for condominiums about 1,700, two-family and three-family about 9,000, four-family plus about 19,000, and single-family over $10,000 in increased taxes over this period on the median building in each of these categories. The ENRSC approached the needs of the town and the schools and the impacts on individuals with the bottom line recognition that voters are going to be deciding this. They will have the last say. And our goals were to minimize the likelihood of a total override failure with the adverse impacts that would have on the town and the schools, and frankly, on the town credit rating, where the failure of an override affects the town's credit rating. We also wanted to recognize the personal hardships that increased taxes could provide and wanted to minimize those. Forced dislocations, people forced to move, including long-term seniors, long-term residents of the town, forced liens, tax levies, second mortgages. The unanimous vote of the ENRSC, I believe it was unanimous, was to offer a tiered override, include the full override ask, but also a lower amount, give voters the choice, give a real choice. And that takes us as background to the more detailed discussion of options and to Sadaf Kazmi. And let me just personally, as I have in the past, thank Sadaf for the incredible amount of work she's put into pulling all of this together. So thank you.
So shifting gears, we'll talk about the three options that were presented in the report. The first option is to put the entire 23.25 combined override asks. So 5.31 from the town and 17.94 for the schools on the ballot. And this would result in an incremental override levy of 6.99% with a total increase of taxes of 18.27% over the 3-year period, fiscal 27 to 29. Some of the considerations that I think it's important for the select board to be aware of. The first is that the money in this case would be raised on a schedule that maps what was proposed by the town and schools respectively. So the town had requested that their 3-year need be raised upfront in fiscal 27 and then held in reserves until it's needed. The schools, on the other hand, have requested that their funds be raised on an annual basis, mapping to the deficit that is forecasted in each one of those years. In this particular option, as a result of the different methods, with the school requests being larger, the overall ramp would be more gradual and therefore ultimately less jarring for taxpayers in Brookline. On the next slide, and I know you can't see this, certainly from this room, but I'm not going to delve into all the numbers. I did add a graph to this slide that I thought might be useful to help people understand what the stabilization fund looks like here. So in green, that line is, you can see in year 1, the town actually pays into their stabilization fund, and then it grows a little bit in year 2, and then it's used in year 3. So that was sort of the general, I think, headline on this particular graph. And yeah, I was really looking for a way to help illustrate this method of implementing the incremental tax levy, because it is different from what Brookline has done in the past. So on the next slide, option 2, this would be front loading of the tax levy increase into 2027, while covering the full fiscal 27 to 29 deficit for the town and the schools. So in this case, both the town and the schools would front load their request, similar to what the town had proposed, and we included in option 1. As a result, the overall override amount would actually be reduced by $4.7 million roughly to 18.6 million, with an incremental override levy of 5.59 and a total of 16.89 over the total 3-year timeframe. So this ends up resulting in an initial higher raise, but a total overall number that is smaller. And I think, sometimes it's hard for people to get their head around this. But what would happen is similar to the example of the town before, that excess initial revenue that would be raised would be held in an interest-bearing stabilization fund and be used later on, but you're sort of ramping up quickly versus ramping up more slowly. I think it's worth noting that in this situation, what happens is that you would have the opportunity to fund the full deficit for both the town and the schools. And you do actually end up over the 3 years raising more money, because you would end fiscal 29 with some money left in the stabilization fund to actually cushion the transition from fiscal 29 to fiscal 30. So the stabilization fund structure, as I mentioned before, is new for Brookline residents, and we believe that this will require some level of education for everybody to really understand this. And it is because of that initial raise would happen for the entire 5.59 incremental tax levy as part of this override, it might be more jarring for taxpayers as a result. And we think that's important to understand and be part of this conversation. On the next slide, similar to what I did for option 1, I laid out what the stabilization fund would look like, as well as the incremental levy increase, both specific to the override and the overall increase in taxes that is already planned as part of existing debt exclusions that had been approved before, plus incremental allowed Proposition 2.5 increases year over year. All right, option 3. So as Dick mentioned, this was our preferred option. And the objective here is to ensure that voters have options by adding tiers to what is put on the ballot. So it can be applied to either option 1 or it can be applied to option 2. But ultimately, provide taxpayers with the option to choose to fund all, none, or some intermediate amount or amounts, right? That's also an option of the override requests. So this would require that the town and PSB provide a prioritized list of services that would need to be cut if that intermediate amount, or depending on what that intermediate amount is. And that is not something that we included in this presentation because the committee was not in a position to actually get to that level of detail on the school side. And we really do think that that prioritization needs to come from the schools and the towns respectively, and for that discussion to be had within the select board. as I mentioned before, and as Dick had mentioned as well, the committee strongly recommends this option. We want to make sure that Brookline voters have a choice in how much they fund and agree to an incremental tax override. And so we want to make sure that this is something that's put in front of voters. The other thing that's worth mentioning here, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, is that the school subcommittee had a proposal that we would like to have an MOU that is included as part of this override proposal. And the objective of that is that we acknowledge that this is a large number, right? All of the numbers included in these presentations are big, the deficit is large. And we think it's important from a voter confidence standpoint to say that we agreed to put this recommendation forward on the part of the committee, but we also believe that there are longer term cost structure opportunities that collaboratively the town and the schools should work together on, so that in 3 years, we've resolved some of these longer term cost structure opportunities. There are also some items in there that request that the town and the schools work together to increase revenue. But the ultimate objective is to get the town more holistically, with a small t, to a better place after this override cycle. So that was really the impetus, and I'll talk through what is included there in a minute. Any questions so far? Yes.
I do have one, and I have to admit, I just don't understand the front loading and how it reduces the ask by maybe 4 million. That's not interest, right? If someone can, I'm really struggling with how that works. Is there some way to explain that?
Yeah, so I can talk through it at a high level, and Chaz, I think you might be the resident expert on that, but essentially what happens is that the tax levy increases, but you take it all up front, right? So instead of ramping slowly and getting to the 23.2, you would ramp up quickly and then you sort of remain flat. So ultimately, but you're collecting that incremental 5.59 every year, right? Because then it's baked into your new base upon which the Prop 2.5% is applied. And so ultimately you end up collecting a little bit more in this scenario in option 2 at the end of the 3 years. And that's why you have some funds to bank in the stabilization fund. It might be worthwhile to look at the financials, that a little bit more detail.
Is there anything you want to add to that, Chaz?
No, I mean, that's, it is, your question is the question that a lot of people asked at the committee and elsewhere, which is, how do why does that number go down? And how is it possible that it goes down by so much? And the answer is, you're using one-time funds to defray the costs. It's the one-time funds that you're raising up front, but then defray the cost in the out years, as opposed to a pay-as-you-go model. So it's a structure you would use if you expected your conditions in FY30 and beyond to be better than they are now. Because the danger of a model like that is that, right, you're spending this one-time money that you saved up to cover your operating costs.
Mhm.
If your operating costs continue to post a large structural deficit, you're actually worse off than you were before at the end of that process than the beginning. But from our perspective, we do think that FY30 is going to be somewhat of a bridge year. It's not, we're not going to be out of the woods. And then in 31 and 32, we see economic indicators shifting in a way that is beneficial for the town and the schools. So that's what makes this
I
process.
appreciate it. I still don't get it, but I appreciate
Sorry.
Absolutely worth discussing, because I think it's a conversation that ultimately, if you go down this path, needs to be understood by everybody. I think Sadaf made the point that the tax levy is increased immediately, okay, by whichever is coming in up front. And because of that, you're raising that money every year, whereas before, if you're ramping, you don't raise the levy as much.
Okay, so you're raising the base levy immediately as opposed to incrementally. Okay.
Immediately and continuously.
So the second year, you've got that gap again. So overall, over the period, while the override amount is lower, total dollars raised is higher.
Okay, Mike?
I'm wondering what the interest rate assumption you made is for the stabilization fund, so how much of that 4.65 million is coming from interest as opposed to an increase in collection rate, right?
2%.
2%.
Yeah,
Right.
very conservative.
It's very conservative.
Can I ask one more question? Since Cliff did such a great job in explaining that, and thank you, you simplified it for me. So from let's take it from the taxpayer's perspective of the ability to pay. So that actually means that the taxes are gonna be higher at the beginning and throughout. Right? So it's the tax impact on an individual taxpayer or renter is gonna be higher throughout that process because you're raising the base at the beginning, correct?
So,
Not throughout.
so not throughout, because at the end, the last year, you know, you're going to be being.
Yeah.
Okay, but I think it's in the first 2 years, clearly you're raising more in the first year, and then in the second year, there is that delta. So, but at the end, I think you're looking at being at the same place as you.
Right.
We're very, very close.
I guess
Actually be about 2 percentage points less. So yeah, your taxes would go up a little less overall in the 3-year period, but they would go up a lot in year 1.
Okay.
if I may.
Sure.
So my understanding is, again, Paul, I appreciate from the taxpayer's perspective, what you are proposing in option 2 is, if the taxpayer needs to allocate a certain amount of money to pay their taxes over the 3 years, what you're telling them is instead of spreading the increase out over those 3 years, you're saying the town is gonna ask for more of that money upfront. And the town is then going to hold that money and get a little interest for it. And then in the second year, they're gonna ask for maybe a little more, but roughly about the amount either way. And then in the third year, they would ask for a little less.
So in the third year, so in the second and third year it would be the baseline of 2027 plus the Proposition 2.5 statutorily allowable increase. So it goes up, and then, you know, in 28 and 29, it goes up, but by a much smaller amount.
But relative to option 1,
Yes.
that has.
That is more of
That
a
has more
steeper, yeah.
slants, the taxpayers are providing more of their money for fiscal year 27. Relative to option.
That's right. That's right.
So that's the shock.
And that is the potentially what is more jarring for taxpayers. In the past, obviously, what we've done for overrides has been what we would sort of term the more traditional
Yeah.
Brookline override grant.
I think one of the things about, first, I have no preference for one or the other, first thing. I think one of the things about option 2 is that you have to be defining what you're calling an override, okay, versus what you're calling taxes, because they're different. And so the override number is lower, but the revenue that's being raised is more because you are increasing the levy.
In the beginning, yeah.
That's the difference. And so there's a terminology issue there,
Yeah.
that people would need to get their head around. On the other hand, one of the other benefits of 2, as Sadaf said, and as Chaz alluded to, is you are tempering for people the possibility of another override in 2030, which may be required, but it's going to be helped by having some of this excess revenue.
Brenda, can I ask one
Yeah.
more question? So, and I'm not thinking amounts right now as to how we're tiering it, but, just for the sake of discussion. So we're saying at 18 million with a front loaded, you're basically getting the same benefit of doing the 23 million or 24 million, right? Does that actually apply as if we decide there's a lower amount, like say 14 million? I don't know what the next step down is, that if you front load it, is it similar to getting 18 million if you front load it early?
It's a good question. You get a benefit to front loading relative to a slightly higher, you know, it's relative to 14, we're using the example of 14. If you were to front load 14, relative to ramping more, slowly for
Yeah.
14, the benefit of front loading 14 will be higher. The flip side to that is that and it's worth looking at the numbers, and Chaz has actually run some of these scenarios, so that, that might be worth discussing for the select board. But at some point, you won't be able to pay all of the deficit in fiscal 29, right? And maybe in fiscal 28, depending on how much, what that number is. So that's point number one. The second point is that you won't be in a position where you won't have the stabilization funding to actually temper the transition from fiscal 29 to fiscal 30. Before additional potential relief might exist in fiscal 31, which, obviously needs to be something that is also discussed by the select board. So it depends on what that number is fundamentally.
The other consideration for the select board, comes around and me, Jack, and talk about this more, is that when you have this money in reserve, it's potentially fair game. And so, fair game. So you can't walk away.
Piece of it.
So that is a consideration, whether or not you feel that town meeting will honor that. Or use it to fund mandates, or, other folks who might be looking at that excess, revenue and reaching out for it. I think that's a consideration.
Did you talk about conditions on the,
So there are conditions on the fund.
Yeah.
But the conditions are very broad. They're to fund operating costs more generally. So town meeting could appropriate out of that. But what I would say to that is, yes, that is a risk, and perhaps it is more of a because the money is there, it's more concrete. But theoretically, town meeting could have done that during the last override too, right? When you put an override question on the ballot, all it says is, do you want your tax levy to go up by this number of dollars? Now, in Brookline, last time, that was $11.98 million. Now, we promised as a community that we weren't going to increase taxes by more than a certain dollar amount every year. But that promise was not on the ballot. Town meeting could have broken that promise. And in fact, in the second year of the override, there was a proposal that was briefly floated to do that. We yelled and shouted and waved our hands and said that would be extremely bad to break that promise to the taxpayers. But, once the levy is raised, the levy is raised. Once the cap is raised, the cap is raised, and town meeting could appropriate to the levy if it so chose. So that risk is there.
last point, now I'm gonna be quiet so they continue. The difference between changing a commitment to the voter, where we're actually it's at the time of the levy and when the money comes in, versus a stabilization fund, it's a bucket of money that everybody can see. And it's a lot, it's a lot more tempting, I think, to have a bucket of money there, which I'm glad to say it's a valid point. I don't know what that means, but it's certainly a valid point.
John,
Before I say anything, I want to say that I think that the work of this, ERSC has been extraordinary. And I recognize, I'm sort of tangentially involved in it. A backup member of the committee as a whole, and then a member of the town subcommittee. But I will confess to having been a skeptic at the beginning, because the task that was set before the ERSC was so enormous. And at one point, we got a breakdown in the form of an outline, which I believe you provided, Sadaf. And I looked at the outline and I said, we're never gonna get this done. There's 62 different lines to this outline here. When the final product emerged a week ago, and I read into it, I was just, I was very proud of what was accomplished, but also, I'll admit, it's gonna take me a while to figure out how the heck you got it all together. Because, we had many meetings and you expect, everything to kind of come together tidily at the meetings, but it doesn't always work out that way. There's a lot left up in the air in the last days of these committee meetings. And then all of a sudden, there's the report, and holy cow, everything we were talking about got into this report, and in ways that I think the average person can understand. So I heartily commend this report to people, especially the executive summaries. The executive summaries are enough to fully to provide the average person with a very comprehensive understanding of what we're being asked to do here as a town. So that being said,
I think Paul has raised an important point that's been on the minds of many of us. If we're struggling to have explained to us what this difference between option 1 and option 2 is, imagine what it's gonna be like trying to explain it to the average voter. And the amounts of money that are being talked about here are extraordinary. They're way above what we've asked for before in override questions. So that is, in and of itself is gonna be kind of a stumbling block for a lot of voters. To then say, for you to get to acceptance of an extraordinary amount of money also requires you to understand the difference between the option 1 of how to raise it and the option 2 of how to raise it. I think is maybe, too far, a climb, but others can weigh in on that. I'm also not certain that this has to be part of the decision we make, in the sense that, as Chaz was just sort of implying, a lot of things kind of remain open-ended when override questions are dealt with by voters. Including, Chaz, I don't want to misstate what you said, how much we raise and when.
Yeah.
So that's already kind of baked into the choices that others are going to face once the overall amount for 3 years is agreed upon. So why put it in front of the voters to sort of have to comprehend what it means to choose 1 over 2, when in fact, they're not even the final say on that. And when in fact, the very thing that we're deciding to put in front of voters is something we could decide after the voters first approve the total amount of the override. Yeah. So Mike, I'm sure Michael is wondering if I characterize this correctly.
I take your point that, once you vote to increase the levy, right, the allocation of that increase is dependent over time. But my understanding of sort of the history of overrides is that when the select board puts an override on the ballot, it comes with some level of commitment to how that's being done. So, whether those promises are in terms of the timing of the increase that we actually use of the levy, or, how the increased money is spent. I think what you're saying is sort of what was said before, is that, we could, for example, put a $24 million ask on the levy with a schedule of when we are going to, how we're going to increase it, and then break that schedule and raise more money up front, and put it in the override stabilization fund. I mean, that would be an option, but I wouldn't think that as a select board, we would want to go to the voters with that plan in place to sort of make a series of promises for this money and then change them.
Well,
I wonder if we're starting to go down a little bit of a rat hole, and do you have more slides you want to go through?
I know many people read the executive summary, so just shifting into the school subcommittee content. I summarized on slide 13 the ask from PSB, and it's worth noting that we didn't get an opportunity to dive deep into the ask from PSB, just given time limitations and capacity constraints from the PSB team. So this comes from their financial summary, which I included here. But they have presented for fiscal 27 a mostly level service budget. They did have some cuts. Some of these were right sizing. Some of these were actually cutting some technology education positions, among a few other things that are listed here in efficiencies, and that amounted to 22.1 FTEs and reduction in their baseline proposed budget. They had a few things that were restored, one important position on data and information systems, right? This person will help provide better data from PSB, which I think is important. They have a series of sort of smaller investments, the curriculum renewal, Google Workplace, et cetera. And then they have a series of adjustments, and this is really, a little bit of moving dollars across the balance sheet, so to speak. On slide 14, the PSB team I've summarized what the PSB team presented for their failed override scenarios. So in fiscal 27, this would mean a failed override would mean that 58 FTEs would be cut on top of the 22 that are already baked into their baseline plan. This includes grade 1 paras, 6 to 8 are all middle school world languages, classroom and guidance staff, as well as central office staff. And then looking forward into fiscal 28 and 29, that failed override would result in some pretty significant cuts, about 130 FTE, primarily classroom teachers. So this is K-8 school sports, other athletic program, the South Brookline bus service, which had been a prior commitment and a prior override in 23. And the PSB team was concerned that this could actually result in some compliance, certification and legal issues. So I thought that was worth calling out as well. And I think Mariah is on the call in case people have questions about this, or she might have had to drop, but she will be back.
Susan Gibbons is on as well.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great. I'm just, I think questions on this should be directed to the PSB team. So on the next slide, one of the things that I alluded to earlier is that we had limited capacity from the PSB admin team, and the budget numbers weren't shared until really right before the holidays. So the group actually focused our analysis on things that we could do independently and things that didn't require or that required very limited data from PSB. So we want to actually acknowledge the work that PSB put in to really right sizing the budget and the numbers and the staffing. So that was a really positive thing from our perspective and truly a good faith effort. They've also started a program or have plans to start bringing non-resident students into PSB's special education programs for a tuition-based admission. And this is something that has been talked about for about 10 years. And we really appreciated Superintendent Wong and her team's commitment to actually try this out. And we expect to see revenues coming in to PSB from this starting in fiscal 28. So we thought that was good. So as we mentioned earlier, our recommendation for an override had a number of things that we wanted as commitments for that. And the real impetus behind this is that we believe that in order to instill voter confidence, given the size of the number, given the deficits that we saw last year, we think it's important to take a look at some of the longer term cost opportunities, while also acknowledging that both the town and PSB have done a lot of work to address the things that are more straightforward going into fiscal 27. So we think the trajectory is really positive. Superintendent Wong, I think, has done a tremendous amount of work in a very difficult situation. And there are a list of things that we think are still important to be explored. That starts on the next page. And I will give the one-line summary for all of these. The first is that we're asking PSB and town admin to collaborate on negotiating a reduced healthcare premium contribution by the town for all town and PSB employees. And the goal here would be to align that contribution with comparable communities by the end of calendar year 2028. The next one is for PSB to create an approach through which the schools can manage their wage expenses to a level that's approaching our projected year-over-year revenue growth. And, look at creative ways to manage that from a contractual standpoint. I want to acknowledge here that we understand collective bargaining can be difficult and complex, and we're not participating in that process. But we thought that this was worth pointing out, just given the size of the percentage of the PSB budget that wages comprise. Number 3 is to evaluate an updated school model to look at cost savings through classroom consolidation, whether it's part of the middle school model or whether it's just redistricting and taking a look at the overall districts across Brookline to see if there's some optimization that can be done there for cost savings. Number 4 is to complete the work that the town and school MOU from this past fall had included with respect to Munis to make sure that our financial systems are consistent and we can get the right information that we need and really streamline that overall process. And the request is to complete that work by the end of fiscal 27. Number 5 is to ensure that teaching assignments align with contractual terms while maintaining the necessary student support programs. We also wanted to caveat this with the fact that the school subcommittee didn't have time to really pressure test data on, how the classroom, how teaching loads are right now and how much room, so to speak, there is within those, because we didn't have, the time, unfortunately, to do that. On the next slide, a few more things. Most of these are revenue, revenue opportunities. 6 is the last cost one. We just evaluate further cutting of technology leases. The schools did actually trim several $100,000 from their technology line item by sharing computers for younger grades. We think there might be some additional opportunity, and we're asking that this is looked at. And then number 7 is to ensure that all third-party users of our space are paying market rent. And to take a look at the policy around this, and really try to negotiate fair market rates. And this does not include our extended day programs, which we know cannot afford that. Number 8 is to commit to conducting a pilot in partnership with the town to test a more robust model of facilities governance. We think there's some opportunity here to drive incremental revenue as well as overall streamline the process. And then the final one, number 9, is to take a look at the BEAT financials and see if there's an opportunity to get this to break even for the revolving fund portion of the program. There was some additional analysis that we undertook on the next slide, and those are listed here. There's a follow-up to the CLA report, the Townsville financial model, and enrollment forecasts. So on slide 19, the quick summary of the CLA report, and I know this group has obviously seen this before, but we took a look at the CLA report and the memos from the school committee, the Townsville MOU from October, and a series of other documents. And there's been a material amount of progress since that CLA report was published in May of last year. The subcommittee unfortunately did not have the expertise and specialized knowledge to confirm that things like HR policies were addressed. And so we had proposed a third-party review of this, and based on that, CLA was engaged a week ago, maybe. And as this group knows, they will deliver a final report on March 31st, and we look forward to seeing what the outcome of that is. Over to Cliff.
So the town school financial model, back in the summer, a subcommittee, well, actually the first subcommittee for the overall committee was formed to take a look at the formula, the town school partnership formula, and evaluate whether or not there were changes that might be appropriate. The group never completed its work. And as a result, the subcommittee and the full committee believes that group should be revived, whether if some people are willing to do it or just new folks. And to take a step back and take a look and see whether or not there's a belief that what we are doing and the way we're approaching things is optimal. And you know, the big issue really is above the line and below the line costs. And whether or not how we are doing things right now provides the level of transparency to the community, so that people really understand the impact of certain things, provide more accountability. So for example, if healthcare costs are below the line, right now they're above the line, but if they're below the line, people can see the allocation of those costs. That might provide a better understanding of the impact of certain decisions when it comes to hiring people, both for the community, but also for those making the decisions, because right now they're looking at the allocation they get below the line, and they're really not thinking so much about above the line. Paul?
Just briefly, because I know we use above and below the line. We throw that around all the time, and I assure you, on this call, I have no idea what you're talking. We're talking fixed and variable.
So if it might be, this is a point where it might be worthwhile actually going and taking a look at.
The report has an excellent layout, is what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you. The chart from up the top.
Slide 4.
Yeah, slide 4. Okay, so if that can be made bigger for those at home. If you take a look at the top line, that's the forecasted revenue, that's the revenue the town is going to be getting from all of its sources, with the exception of enterprise funds. Okay, it's a lot of money. Now, if you take a look at the next line, forecasted revenue for allocation, there's,
Sorry.
there's close to $200 million missing.
Mhm.
What is it? What are those? Where did that money go? Well, that money goes to expenses that are considered above the line expenses, and those are shared expenses. Shared expenses or expenses that are sort of fixed, and you can't do anything about it. So what do those include? Debt service, right? You can't allocate that because it's already spoken for. Assessments from Norfolk County. And benefits. We treat benefits as a shared expense above the line. So all those different shared costs and fixed costs, if you will, are taken out before an allocation is made to the town and the schools. And that's why you see that big gap in the numbers. So that's what we mean by above the line and below the line. Now, if you were taking some of those expenses that are now above the line and you were moving them to below the line, it would provide more transparency to people. And let's again use the example of benefits. So if you add, I don't know what the cost of benefits is off the top of my head, but it's maybe
Close to $100 million.
okay. Let's use $100 million. So that number would go up to 347 million. That revenue would be allocated then to town and schools. And people would realize how much money that there is being given to benefits by each side. And that is that's impactful for both the community to understand, but also for the decision makers. So they're not looking, for example, at a salary of $100. They're understanding that the salary of $100 is actually a cost of $130, whatever the add-on for the benefits are. And that's one reason to consider going, taking some of those expenses below the line. It also, in the financial model, things we would look at or suggest people look at would be evaluate further consolidation of departments, establish clear relationships between departments via memorandums of understanding. You know, there are some that have been discussed for decades and have not been executed. And so if there's a review and there are ideas that come out of the review, then maybe there's a way to move those forward better. Another thing that we brought up last year and certainly can be looked at and maybe should be looked at is the utility of establishing a special education fund, reserve fund. Why? Special education takes up roughly 23% of the overall school budget. Special education is something that's mandated both by the state laws as well as federal laws. These are services that are required. There is no decision to be made about whether or not you're going to provide special education services. And because Brookline has a number of a big churn in its population, people come in during the year, they leave during the year. Anyone who comes in and needs special education services, they have to be provided. And some of those can be very expensive and unanticipated. And the other thing is that the state can decide in the middle of the year that they're giving a boost to the folks who run special education transportation, or they're letting, you know, some of the special education out of district schools raise their tuition rates in the middle of the year, and those are unanticipated. So having a reserve fund might be a worthwhile thing, so that there aren't unavoidable shocks in the middle of the year. Just something to evaluate. Okay, enrollment forecast. This is something that comes up every year. And it is a question that really is important. going back in time in the, 2010 to 2016 period, when there was a significant increase in enrollment in town, the approach to forecasting was, I'm gonna say retrospective. I think that's the word that people have decided that we should use. In other words, it looked more at history. And it used history to project. And did not take into account demographic changes, forecasts, economic environment, so on and so forth. The issue with that, it can be very accurate for, let's say, 1 year, going out 1 year. It's not gonna be accurate going out more than a year, because all you're doing really is just continuing the past. And we saw that with the projected enrollment back in, 8, 9 years ago, where it was just a 45-degree line. It was always gonna go up, and that didn't happen. So the recommendation here is that as the school committee has done periodically in the last 6 or 7 years, to retain an outside independent party to do a long-range forecast that takes into account demographic information, economic information, and you use that along with your 1 year forecast. Try to bring in as much of that forward-thinking data as possible to give, again, the community the sense that there's a process that is forward-thinking, more than a 1 year forecast is going to give you. So that's just another suggestion. We just merely suggesting that the school committee establish a policy to make sure that that's done.
So,
Jan? Yeah.
there you
Okay, go ahead, Jan. Are you awake?
Janet should be on the phone, was unable to be here with us today, but should be on the line.
So maybe.
She's the 617, so the number ending in 616.
She's currently muted.
No, 5933.
She's not on.
We may want to check if that's her anyway on a different phone, maybe.
No, she said,
No. We are not seeing her.
I just asked her.
This is Janet Gelbart.
Yes, Jennifer.
Yeah. Mm.
Okay, while we do that, oh, I'm sorry, do you have a question? I was gonna. skip it.
So many questions. Sorry.
Yeah, I am writing down.
616 is her number, so.
Oh, it is?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
great,
yeah,
great.
yeah.
Let's promote that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Sorry.
I think you can allow to speak or something like that.
And then Janet, if you can hear us, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me? Can you
There
hear
we
me
go.
now?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm not sure why when I logged on, I couldn't get to you through Zoom. So I am looking at slides on my computer, and we'll need someone's assistance. I'll tell you when to move forward. Sorry I couldn't be with you today, but what I thought was a sprained ankle turned out to be a broken fibia. So I'm at home.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, well, I won't go into why we need to repair the sidewalks. All of the numbers in the town section are numbers you should be familiar with. They go back to probably the presentation to the select board in December with some minor adjustments. So regardless of whether an override passes, there will be savings on the town side. 5 FTEs will be eliminated. 2 of those are going to be moved to soft money, 1 in the rec department to the revolving fund, and 1 in public health, which can be absorbed by the tobacco remediation fund, which will be around for a while. So these are not, we're going to move them now and have a problem next week. The biggest chunk is reducing the contribution to the CIP from 6.6 to 6%. And also the decision to level fund OPEBs, not add to the amount that that are traditionally there, which is around 5 million. There has been an additional allocation of about 250,000. That didn't happen in this year. It's being projected not to happen next year. The amounts that you're seeing on the screen are the town's portion of those funds, because this is something that happens below the line. There's a surplus in the elections fund, so that would be reduced, and then just some minimal contracted services that would be eliminated. There are some new fees, primarily related to parking fees. Again, the amounts on the screen is the town's share after it goes through the split. And what will also come out of those parking fees is some monies to upgrade the meters, which has been a request for a while. Next slide, please. Are you with me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the override proposal. It's continuity of service. There's nothing in here that hasn't been around for a while. The top number is about 1.3 million, which won't have to be cut. These are positions and a little bit of services and other things that would be cut without an override, and it's a variety of departments. The biggest number is for the fire department contract, 900,000 for increased new steps will come into play at the tail end of the contract. So that's 2028 or 2028, sorry. And then 800,000 for overtime. Overtime has been around and ignored and not been budgeted for, but it's going to happen. So we thought it's a good idea to actually throw it in the budget. This will only go away, I think, if the town were able to negotiate changing the way fire apparatus are manned from four men at all times to 3 if needed because of firefighters being out. But that's something that the town has agreed not to raise again until they're in negotiations for the next contract. And as I said, the current contract expires at the end of 2027. So just keep that in mind. This is also something that's been around for a very long time. Police department, there's a request for 600,000 to restore 3 positions that were cut in their last contract, again, to make sure that it was affordable to the town. There's also 300,000 for upgrading their software, their dispatch software, which is about to lose its support. And some monies to bring command positions in the department more in line so that the command staff are not making essentially the same amount of money as their reports because of the increases the reports got in the last contract. DPW, there's a couple of things in there. The first is funding the tree protection bylaw that was passed by town meeting that has not generated the level of fees as the town predicted. So if that part isn't funded, we're essentially telling the town to not enforce the law. This is an unfunded mandate. The other part is for sustainability positions. These are currently being funded by a grant, which runs out at the end of 2027. And without those positions, the town will not be able to proceed with its solar initiative, which will be discussed later on in the futures section of this report. But that's a way to save money on electricity costs going forward. The money for the Council on Aging represents, this is something that's been funded through ARPA as a pilot over the last several years. It is essential to seniors. It gets them to and from medical appointments. It is the first time that there will be a line item in the operating budget for senior transportation, which has been put together through grants over the years. And the original proposal that was funded under ARPA had no constraints on it. The Council on Aging has put in a program now that people using medical transportation are subject to the same income rules and how many times a month you could use it, because the program as initially implemented was just not sustainable. The building department needs funds for maintenance. It needs funds for staff so that they're not contracting out services like plumbing. IT licenses both go up in cost faster than inflation, and there have been support from the federal government, which will most likely disappear if it hasn't already, because we're not complying with the president's request regarding how we run our business here in Brookline. And then there's money for collective bargaining reserve because all of the town's contracts, the 5 non-public safety contracts are in negotiation now. Police and fire come on again. This allows for some of the costs that should have been included the last time around. Mm-hmm. Next slide. Without an override. 17.4 FTEs plus services, supplies, and part-time staff will disappear in 2027. That's inclusive of the 6 police positions and the cuts that will be made even with an override. In 2028, in order to fund the tail that's in the contract, they need to cut 20 firefighters, which is the equivalent of 1 engine crew. And in 2029, potentially another 5 FTEs would have to be cut. They haven't been identified as to where, but just to stay within the constraints of 2.5. So without an override, it is very dire. And the town subcommittee fully supported the town request for $5.31 million in an override. That's it for me.
Can I ask a quick question, Chance?
Yeah.
Sure, not, thanks. The sustainability funding, could we go back to the?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll go back a slide. Thank you. Stop there. So DPW tree protection and sustainability position, 625,000.
Yep.
How many positions are in sustainability with that?
Fund 2 positions.
There are 2 positions that are now funded from a very generous anonymous donation, funded it over 3 years. So it's 2 positions. The director of sustainability is in the operating budget.
Okay, again, if I could just, I get Chaz here. I just want to ask Chaz a question, if you could hold on 1 second. So Chaz, these 2 positions that are funded by the generous donation, this is what we're talking. So this would pick up
Yes,
for those, and there's already 2.
yes.
Okay,
So there's 1 position, there are 2 positions on the operating budget that moved over.
Yeah.
So, the conservation coordinator is now in sustainability, used to be in parks.
so, but it was said that in order for us to pursue the solar initiative, which I think the solar initiative came out of this subcommittee, not even from our sustainability division, so I will say that first. What? What's that?
Yeah, they worked with the same.
They worked, but it
come
was,
up with the
yeah, but
idea.
I'm saying it can't, but it did come out of this study, which is good. Do we need 4 people to do that, or would these 2 people be needed to do the solar initiative, and we couldn't do the solar initiative without these 2 positions?
I think given the amount of work that they're already doing, and we can, when DPW presents their budget in the coming weeks, I think it will be important to have this conversation about how much sustainability is already doing.
Yeah.
Like, it's really, the work that they're doing to try and integrate themselves into the operating process means that they're really taxed as it is. Alexandra is trying to be everywhere at once. She's dealing with, crisis response. She's dealing with, the climate, emergencies. She's dealing with the climate, the CARP, the climate action plan. So all of that stuff is, all of that stuff is happening. I think it's important, we can give you a fuller picture of what it is that DPW is doing in there. But I think the answer is yes, something would have to give in that circumstance.
So these 2 positions, just to kind of simplify it, these 2 positions would be, in your mind, more associated with enabling the solar initiative?
Yes.
Okay, that's right.
And
Just for clarity, the 625 there says it's for two things. Is there a division between those two?
Yes, so actually, right, as it currently stands, it would be 325,000 for sustainability operations, 200,000 for tree protection, and 100,000 for the horticultural specialist who was cut during COVID and never restored.
Okay. The future subcommittee. Um, So the future subcommittee focused on, next slide, please. Focused on initiatives that we thought would benefit the town, but outside of the 3 override window. We looked at things for cost reduction, cost avoidance, revenue increasing opportunities, and other. I do want to say that the first 2 items on this list, the solar initiative and electrical demand management, were items that were focused on by Sergio Modigliani, and I will do my best to accurately relay what he would say, but I am caveating my comments. Okay, solar initiative, electrical demand management, school model analysis, which we've already talked about a little bit, economic development, and OPEX. So let's take them one by one. The solar initiative, you just obviously heard about it a little bit. The committee recommends approval of the sustainability division's $3.2 million initiative. That's a cost with tax credits. That cost can be reduced to $2.1 million. This would be an effort to put in solar panels on a number of identified buildings that in town that are constructed in a way that where those panels can actually be used. Why would we do this? Looking at long-term offers where we can install these types of installations offers a degree of control over our electrical utility costs, which are increasing and have been fairly rapidly increasing, as everyone, I think, who pays an electric bill understands. The initial phase of this process is projected to supply an additional 13% of our current electric usage. And it would provide an annual cost avoidance. It's not going to generate revenue, but it will enable us to reduce what we're taking from the utilities. So it's a cost avoidance of roughly $390,000. And over a 25-year projected period, that would return an internal rate of return ranging from 14 to 24%, depending upon the assumptions you make about the increases in electricity and the size of the tax credits. And that 14% assumes no tax credits and a 3% increase, annual increase in electricity costs. The 24% IRR represents a 5% inflationary assumption in electric costs and a full, I think it's 30% tax credit. So that's the range. And from a financial perspective, it's a pretty good range. Certainly convincing enough to the committee to recommend that the initiative be followed through on. Okay. Electric demand management. A demand charge is a cost that's added to your standard usage cost per kilowatt hour. And a demand charge is based on peak usage during any 15-minute period in a billing cycle. And once it's determined, it is then added to every kilowatt hour in the monthly cycle. So the demand charge can represent 25 to 40% of the total electric bill, which is really pretty stunning. There are opportunities to mitigate this cost. One is to spread loads by controlling when certain pieces of equipment are allowed to turn on. So to make sure that if you've got several pieces already turned on, that, you know, the next largest one has to wait a little bit, and maybe that means an air conditioner unit in a particular location doesn't get turned on for 15 or 30 minutes until something else gets turned off. It's, I gather, I think that our building department feels that this is something that they try to do already. And providing additional emphasis on this is certainly worth pursuing. The other idea is a battery system, which would be charged during non-peak load hours, periods. And then that power would be used to run equipment when it's needed for peak usage, and at the same time reduce the demand from the utility. Which would obviously lower the demand, the peak demand number. Systems are available, reliable, and cost effective. This is just something that the subcommittee feels should be focused on to try to, again, control our utility costs. Did you want to say anything else about the school model? Or not?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick statement, which is that I think, and I'm biased because I wrote this section, but I do think that this is worth reading. Because there has been, there's some interest in revising the school model on the part of the community. We looked at it really as a cost driver or potential cost driver. But there are other reasons why parents might be interested in this, and we didn't delve into those. But we did actually hear from Superintendent Wong that she is interested in studying this, starting, she said, targeting the summer. So like cost savings opportunities and potential upsides, yeah.
So you say there's interest in the community, I mean, how do we know that?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of that is, I will admit, anecdotal, in talking to other parents, as a parent myself. So there's, you know, from a lot of the parents groups that I'm part of, there's curiosity and interest in the benefits that might pose from an academic standpoint, as well as potentially a socialization standpoint. I think for some kids in the smaller schools, some kids struggle socially being in a 2-section school for 9 years. And all of those things would need to be weighed, obviously, and that is something that would need to be undertaken by the PSB administration. And Superintendent Wong has expressed interest in taking a look at this, hopefully starting with this summer.
I think definitely have to, as we looked at, I just remember my junior high school years.
Yeah.
That's the worst.
There are pluses and minuses.
And I will say there are 5 different scenarios that are modeled in the document. And none of them is going to one big middle school, right? So the goal is to really preserve the community school feel by having multiple middle schools. I lived in Cambridge for about 10 years before I moved to Brookline, moved back to Brookline. And they actually have a similar model where they have multiple middle schools. They're actually integrated with the elementary schools, and it is it's a different model than the one big, all the schools feeding into one big middle school and then one big high school from a transition standpoint, as well as building utilization standpoint. All right, thank you.
Economic development. This is a rather large section in the report. There's a lot there. There's a lot of really good material there. This is a very brief summary of things that are talked about, and clearly economic development and diversifying the revenue base is a topic that gets a lot of discussion in town, particularly trying to expand the commercial tax base. And so, again, this particular section talks a lot about that, but it really makes the point that economic development is more than just construction. Okay, there's building buildings are one thing, and it's great to get tax revenue, but making sure your local businesses are thriving, making sure that the infrastructure supports those businesses, making sure that the population is continuing to grow in a way that can support economic growth. It's all part of an ecosystem. So what did we focus on in addition to those traditional areas? You know, leadership and staffing. Okay, economic development is by definition a longer term effort. Things don't happen overnight, whether they be, you know, new buildings or they be putting in policies to promote activity. You know, we feel that the select board, and this leans into a recommendation from BFAC, that the select board should have an individual whose primary outside focus would be on economic development. And that is to you know, make sure that the select board has some expertise that's developed, if it doesn't already exist, on staff, at the executive level. And that is something that we felt very strongly about. We think that the town administrator should take an evaluation about of how the unit is staffed and how it reports and where it reports. We also think that it's important for the select board, town meeting, and relevant boards and commissions to have a better understanding of what economic development means and what is required to be successful in that area. Again, this was something that did come up in BFAC, and I guess I should disclose that I was a member of BFAC and former member of EDAB, and so take that.
Little bias.
Excuse me?
Little bias.
I'm biased, I think, well informed. Yeah, thank you. I think that would be a better way of characterizing. It's like so much of what we've talked about today. It's complicated. These are complex issues. Just like the council partnership formula is complex. Just like any of these issues are complex. And people in town and who are in town meetings and have responsibilities don't necessarily fully appreciate or understand the complexities and the nuances. So any education is only going to be beneficial for everybody, whatever people decide, because everyone brings their own biases and perspectives to every issue. Having a better grounding in facts and processes as opposed to anecdotes on social media, we think is important. The comprehensive plan, this really should kind of, you know, obviously this is an important effort that's been going on for several years. I think the expectations that it's going to be finished this coming year. The committee, you know, urged consensus and identification of geographic areas for commercial development, affordable housing, and, you know, other matters. And the recommendation is that the select board, once the comprehensive plan is done, really instruct the town administrator to have a systematic effort to revise the zoning bylaws to address and those areas that have been identified by in the comprehensive plan, so that things can move forward in a more efficient way than they currently do. I mean, certainly people around this table know that virtually every major activity over the last 20 years in Brookline has required an overlay district to be put in place in order for anything to get done. That really should change to bring us Brookline into a more modern environment, for lack of a better term. There are efficiencies that the group feels that could be had to streamline activity in Brookline. One of those, to give the planning board certain authorities to grant smaller scale special permits to ease processes along. Again, the section is voluminous, there's a lot in there. And it's worth reading certainly the executive summary and some of the reports on. Okay. Last item that the future subcommittee spent some time on, the issue of OPEBs. And I personally think this is a really important issue, and I'm going to emphasize that based upon comments that I've heard as recently as last night in a advisory committee, subcommittee meeting that I was chairing. The community is beginning to look ahead and think that in 2031, there's going to be a bucket of money available. And I'm a little surprised to be hearing that.
Mhm.
And it makes this recommendation, I think, actually pretty worthwhile. The first comment from the subcommittee is to not recommend, is to recommend that the select board not lock itself into the policy that they put in place last September. And to appoint a committee that would be in place over the next couple of years to actually evaluate the OPEB policy and to be looking at 2031 and determining whether or not anything can be done or should be done to alleviate the pressure that's going to be coming from forecasts, coming from the community, in terms of taking some of that money or not taking some of that money.
Cliff, can I ask just a quick
Please.
question? I keep doing this for you, and
That's okay.
I want to ground you. Just remember that there's people that have no idea. You're talking about a chunk of money
Okay,
potentially coming available. Why would it become available?
Sure.
If you could provide just that grounding
Yep.
for us, that would be really helpful.
so one of the things back at the beginning, talking about pressures on our budget was listed pensions and OPEB liabilities. The town, I think was mentioned before, is currently on a schedule to fully fund its pension obligations by 2030. By law, it has to do that by 2040. There is no law in place to require funding of OPEBs. Other post-employment benefits, mainly. In 2030, if the town is successful in fully funding, and there will be roughly $40 million that in 2030 will have gone to meet that full funding deadline. That will then currently be allocated towards OPEBs, which would fully fund the OPEBs within 5 or 6 years in theory. Because OPEBs are not required by the state to be fully funded at any given point in time, there is the likelihood of pressure to use some of that money. And the overarching restriction that the community or the select board certainly will be dealing with and staff will be dealing with is whether any of that money could be allocated without jeopardizing the township affairs. And, a lot of folks think that, what's a AAA? Our borrowing costs, if we went down to a AA, it's just not gonna be that much of a difference. And that's an issue that's been raised at town meeting within the last couple of years. And for those on the call, when a municipality or corporation goes to raise money in the debt markets, everyone gets a rating from the rating agencies that tells investors what the credit risk is of the issue. AAA is the highest credit rating, and things go down from there, down to CCC-. Going from a AAA to a AA may not sound like a big deal, but it is. And that's because it's really hard to get a AAA. Okay, and if you lose it, it's two things. Number one, it's really hard to get it back. And number two, it sends a message to the investing community, number one, and to people who provide you with any sort of a credit. That can be trade credit, it can be vendor credit, it can be anything. That something has happened to your fiscal management practices. And so it can be a problem. And so the little change in borrowing costs isn't necessarily the big issue. It's the message that it sends to the world that you're not taking care of your business. And so everything that's in here with this group that is suggested to be looking at the policy, the last point is what's really crucial. Any adjustment to the funding policy that the town already has is subject to a belief, a firm belief, that the town's AAA rating would not be impacted. So that's the overarching constraint. And within that, there are things that can be evaluated. Is it possible to use a portion of these funds? And if so, how would you use them? You know, it goes into a AAA rating. There's a lot of things that go into it. Brookline does well on some of those. It doesn't do well on others. You could use some of that OPEB money maybe to boost up some of those other criteria, as opposed to putting it into operations. There's just a number of things that could be done. And all we're suggesting is that this date is coming, get ahead of the date, because again, town meeting is going to be able to make a decision for everyone. It's better to be as educated as possible so that when that day comes, you can discuss it with analysis that's been conducted by a group. That's all this really is. And that's, that's it.
Great.
Now.
That was quite an earful.
Yeah.
I mean, really comprehensive and I thought very helpful.
Mr. Chair, may I
Yeah.
just ask that, and Cliff can agree or disagree, if I'm correct on this. One of the things that belongs in this conversation is that the schedule we're on now for paying down the unfunded pension liability is a schedule that's more or less required by the state. And yet there would not be such a schedule. So it's all the more important that we have our own outlook as to what we're going to do to pay down OPEBs once there's no longer a unfunded pension liability. Yeah.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And nothing in what this recommendation says would be, forget about OPEBs.
Yeah,
You know, that's not gonna be a conclusion.
right.
It wasn't
right.
a conclusion in this subcommittee, but there are, things are a continuum, and there may be points on continuum.
I think Mike.
So first of all, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation and there's tons of really useful material. I have a process question. So, I have a whole bunch of questions on a whole bunch of things. I'm sure other select board members have a whole bunch of questions on a whole bunch of things that are probably best answered by different people. So how should the select board between now and next week funnel those questions, get answers, circulate those answers amongst other select board members and so on?
Good question. And we have 15 minutes to.
I think it's sort of a,
Yes,
it's an overarching question, because I don't want to dive into a specific
Yeah.
until we.
Good, John.
On that
You ready?
point, if I may, can we maybe right now agree that we will either do a working lunch or reduce our lunch break to 15 minutes? Because I feel like we ought to take advantage of some time here to have a little bit of discussion of this. And not to mention the next item on the agenda, which we're gonna need, some time to discuss.
Why don't we do a working lunch?
Yeah, I'd be fine with a working
Okay.
lunch. I promise to be polite.
Bernard, quick
Yeah,
question.
go ahead.
So, I appreciate the process question. And this would help inform the types of discussion we have now and then next week. What are we hoping to do next week? With respect to this subject? And when do we need to make a decision on a ballot question and potentially the amounts?
So as I envision this, you have to, let's work backwards. You have to make a decision by 11:59 PM on March 31st.
Are we scheduled for
We're
a meeting
scheduled for a
on
meeting on that
31st?
day.
Okay,
Yeah.
not at that time, but
Yeah.
on that day.
On that day.
Okay, all right.
23.
Okay.
So that's your drop dead.
Yeah.
Working back from there, on that date, you should have the information you feel that you need in order to make a decision about whether and what to put on the ballot. In order to get there, in this session, we would appreciate any feedback that you have about the contours of the proposals that were discussed,
Yeah.
and, initial guidance about if we were to tier this, how would you want to structure our tiers? I have some preliminary information that I can
Yeah.
share with you about tiering and what that does in practice and how that works. So we can talk about that as we move it through this.
Yeah.
But then, we want to be ready to come back to you, both the
Yeah.
town and the schools, with, okay, if you tell us to tier it using this rubric, this is what we would cut.
And so that's the majority of the work. Next week is to really dig into this. And then hopefully have the information we need next week to start to do the contours, and then we can deliberate more.
Right.
So Bernard, if I may, I just.
I thought we had to at least have a preliminary sense of what we want to do today.
Yeah,
So that
yeah,
if we're talking about tiering, for example, we have a number that the school committee
Right,
could.
that's what I meant, is that, right, by the end of this conversation today, it would be helpful to have that frame, and you may have more than one, right?
Yeah.
For example, there may be something that you talk about, we want a hard cap, a hard
Yeah.
dollar amount, or, what is, you want a percentage haircut, like what is 10% less of this look like, and what would that mean in practice, like
So a
those.
number, we're gonna try to have at least a ballpark number today.
All right.
Okay, that's helpful to know.
If we
If we
if
can.
we agree to tier.
Yeah,
it.
Right.
yeah,
Or, ideas for how you would do that.
Yeah.
Because then we can come back and tell you,
Yeah.
okay, if the number is X, the
Yeah.
cuts will be Y.
okay, so can I just offer just a quick thought before I lose. So first, there's 1,000 questions, you have 1,000 questions, I have 1,000, but those 1,000 questions may not get us to the outcome that we want to have today or the objective. A couple of thoughts on a bigger picture. This is gonna be a big ask for the voters. And it needs to be simple. Like, they really need to understand it. The first thing I would say, while I appreciate the front loading conversation and option, I think it's very complicated. I think it potentially may confuse the voters. I think if there's some objection, I know there's gonna be a yes campaign, which I will likely support. I know there may be a no campaign, which may pop up. Confusion creates lowers voter ability to vote for something. So I'm concerned about the complexity of a front loading option versus a non-front loading option. So that's the first thing. I do think that it's really important that we have some memorandum of agreement, not having all these things that Cliff laid out as the 9 things that we need to have answered, but at least an agreement that we're gonna address them so that the voters can see that we're gonna work towards the structural issues. I think that's a really important point that we have to address. It's as important as the voters believing that we're dealing with economic development. And I think that's gonna play into this for the next conversation. The last thing is, I would say, I do think we need a tiered approach. I don't think we throw one number at the voters. So that's kind of
What do other people think, tiered versus non-tiered? Yeah.
Good.
Well, I need to learn a lot more about the tier. That's, the first thing I think. And what is concerning to me is to what extent does a tiered situation take us down the road towards something that does not have majority support of the voters actually being the top vote getter in a tiered approach? So, you might have, a big amount of money. And actually only, let's say 40% of people supported that big amount of money. And then you have a slightly lesser, and then you have a slightly lesser. And so 30% of those who didn't support the first number support the slightly lesser, and then somebody do the math for me, 20%, whatever, support the slightly lesser. And so you actually have a majority of people who supported something less than the big amount, but the big amount had the most votes of any of the amounts. Yeah, a plurality. And that to me shouldn't be the formula for us to be, going with the big amount.
Can I ask a question about this? So is the question the voters are being asked to vote on? Override, no override, and if override, one tier or the second tier?
So when you structure a tiered question, you structure it this way. So you would, well, the way that most communities are now structuring tiered questions is there's one question and it says, you can vote for any or all of or none of these sub questions. And the highest dollar amount that gets a majority vote will control. So it will, for example, in Melrose, they said, question 1A is, do you want $13.5 million? And your taxes to go up by $13.5 million. Question 1B was a lower amount, and question 1C was lower still. And the question said, of these, the highest vote getter will control. And so in Melrose, question 1A, it was the highest dollar amount and it was the highest vote getter. In Stoneham, they had a two-tiered override. They had one at like 14 million and one at around 9 million. Again, same structure of question. Whatever the highest dollar amount that gets majority support is the one that passes. And in Stoneham, only one of the questions passed. It was the lower one. And so as a result of that, taxes only went up by that.
I think John's question really is answered by what you just said, in that there won't be a plurality if we have two tiers.
If we,
One of the two tiers is gonna get a majority
yeah,
because the no votes are separate.
yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, but
Uh-oh.
but I'm concerned that
I'm not
we
sure.
might be talking about three tiers. We might be talking about, a full amount and then two tiers of lesser amounts.
So so again, think of it this way. The highest dollar amount controls, all three questions might pass, right? If all three questions pass and one of them passes with 50% support and the lower one passes with 78% support, doesn't matter. The one with 50% support, that's the highest dollar amount controls. So if that highest dollar amount only gets 49% support and one below it gets 51% support, that one
Yeah, but
controls.
see, that feels like stacking the deck to me, because essentially it's saying that there could be a majority of people who didn't support the highest amount. And yet, their voice didn't count as much as the minority who supported the highest amount. And, I think we have to be very careful in how we put it on the ballot so that we don't end up with that kind of a situation.
Michael?
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, I agree with Paul in the option 2 versus option 1 question. I think that trying to explain the front loading is too complicated. I am really uncomfortable with deciding what the tiering is. Particularly for the schools, which is the majority of the money, before the school committee can weigh in and say, this is how we would tier. So that like we have that information and know what the numbers are. You made a second point. At the time I said I agree with it, but I don't remember.
Was it a memorandum of?
Oh, yeah, the memorandum. So Paul and I are on the same page.
So I have a different view on this. I think that offering the voters several options is the best approach to take. I'm confident that our voters are smart enough to be able to figure out the differences and that there can be an education effort. There's a delta of about $5 million between option 1 and option 2. That's meaningful. 5 million isn't zero. And to be able to offer a choice of the front loaded yes, that's a big hit in year one that needs to be explained to voters, but at least that way. There's a choice. Do we want the big hit in year one, but over a 3-year period, it's going to be less? Or do we want to have a bid each year? I think that's a meaningful part of the conversation.
Yeah, so you're saying you're okay with this idea of the formula that should be offered as an option, right? The front-loaded formula.
Yes,
You're not in agreement with Paul, but,
right.
because I think I'm in agreement with Paul. Okay. I
Conceptually,
think that's too confusing.
I actually think that, if you look at this from a long-term perspective, if you are paying less money, that's going to be attractive to many people, even if it's front-loaded.
Yeah, the chair, go ahead.
So just in response to Michael's point about the schools, and I know Susan is on, and I'm sure she can supplement this, but where the schools are now is they have said, we have cut everything we can possibly cut at this juncture. We're not comfortable cutting more. If you tell us to cut more, if you tell us that this is not, then we will do that exercise. But at this juncture, the total gap over the next 3 years for the schools is $17.94 million. That's where they're at. And so I think the question, they've kind of put the question to you, which is that politically viable to ask for that amount of money for the schools alone? And if not, where do you think it needs to be in order for there to be the political will to pass it? And then they can come back to you and say, well, the consequences of giving us less than 100% of where we are now, which to be clear is much lower than where they started. And you really have to commend the superintendent and Susan and their team for, they have a lot less people than we do, and they've done a lot of work trying to get to this point. And it's still a big number. And so, they are, Susan said at the last expenditures and revenue study committee meeting, right? Like, if the select board tells us it's got to go down by X number of dollars, we can give you what the consequences are. But at this point, we're not in a position where they're not going to bid against themselves.
And we're saying, look, the lower tier.
Right.
On this particular point, I agree with Michael. My worry is that if we just go with a number and we don't know what the consequences will be, that's going to lead to voters being very upset. So in the past, for example, we've had an override that passes, and then we eliminate a program that the override was supposedly for. And that creates a lot of distrust in the community when you pass an override and then you're eliminating programs anyway without having explained it all in advance that this may happen. So I worry a little bit about not being transparent with the public there.
Be John has his hand up.
Well, in case anybody's, having a hard time getting their head around the distinction I'm trying to draw, I'll put it another way. I think the ideal formula for an override is 2 questions, okay? I think that the higher amount should be the highest, amount that people feel is needed. And the next amount should be something significantly lower, not a few percentage points lower, but significantly lower. And there should be a yes or a no, highest amount, yes or no, let's say highest amount cut by half or something like that. And then clearly what voters are saying, that they either want the highest amount, yes or no. They either want the significantly lower amount, yes or no. And if they say no to both, then they don't want either. But I don't want there to be confusion as to what the majority of voters are saying when they say, yes or no to this, yes or no to this. If you throw in a third one, you don't really know what they're saying. All you know is that the
So
combination
you're
of
saying
people.
2 tiers.
I'm saying, I don't even like calling them tiers, it's
tiers.
2 options, option 1 and option 2. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well.
So thanks, Bernard. Two quick points. I'm gonna lean towards what John is saying, about the tiers, although I would even simplify it further. I would do it similar to, vote for one of the following. You get 1 vote, a high number, a lower number, or none. And you take whatever gets the most votes, similar to the way we would on.
You created the same problem.
So that's the first thing, but that's the first thing. The second thing I just want to address is this idea about going back and forth with the schools. We don't have a lot of time to ask the schools to give us a prioritized list of cuts. We should decide a number that we think is viable and ask for our next meeting next week, that they come back and say, okay, at that lower number, this is what you would
Yeah,
end
that's
up
what-
losing. Yeah,
I did.
Okay, so. I have a big, there's a big challenge with having two separate votes as you describe. Because it is possible that there are some voters. Not necessarily because it's what they want to do, but if they want the higher number and they don't want the lower number, they might vote. Yes on the higher number. No on the lower number because they want the higher number, but they would rather have the lower number than nothing. So what you could end up doing in that case is you could end up splitting the vote between the two different numbers, and a plurality but not a majority of no votes ends up winning.
I don't agree with that interpretation.
Well,
Okay.
I'm saying it's a risk.
Well, it's a risk, but think about what you just said.
Yes, I have made a case for a choice. That's what we're talking about.
Chaz, next week, we have sort of a list of options in terms of how we structure the tiers.
I will say that
I mean, I thought
I
it
am
was
not aware of
straightforward,
any,
but-
I'm not aware of any communities that have structured it that way.
Which
Right, the way that you're talking about, two separate, you vote for only one. Almost all of them have structured it as cascading options, and then it's the one that has, it's the highest dollar amount controls, to avoid that problem.
the highest vote getting
No, that-
majority done,
No,
Highest dollar amount.
the highest vote.
So
That gets the most votes.
yes, well, no, so imagine there are three tiers, 15 million, 10 million, 5 million.
Yeah.
5 million passes with 56% support.
Yep.
10 million passes with 51% support. And 15 million doesn't pass. It's got
Yep.
48% support. 10 million controls. Even though fewer people voted for it, it has a majority of voters, and so therefore it controls.
I thought.
Still a little confusing for me, but.
What if we just do two tiers? I mean,
You could do just two tiers.
yeah, I mean, is that the simple? I mean, do
But
you
you know
really
that-
want to give the option of just destroying the entire
So-
system?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
may I point out, yeah, Michael makes a point, but I think that point can be done. If the explanation to the voters is quite simply, if you favor the highest amount, you should vote yes on the highest amount, right? If you think if in the event that the highest amount fails, you would favor the second amount, then you should also vote, for the second amount. And then it becomes a clear test of, is there enough people for the second amount when you combine those who were the first amount with those who were no on the first amount, but would be okay with the second amount? That's all.
Assuming you could do the combining.
So, but
Yeah.
it sounds like we're not gonna we're not gonna be able to settle this today.
Oh, no.
Right?
we-
Yeah,
we-
yeah.
And
She knows this out.
town council's office and I will go back and dig
Yeah.
out what's possible
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
You have to be, right, the state has strict restrictions on what you can and can't put on a ballot question.
But do we have enough information to make a stab today at how many amounts and what those amounts are?
We do very, very preliminary, because, we don't wanna lock ourselves into something before we have an opportunity to really.
Just trying to figure out, I'm trying to get my brain ready to make a decision. So.
Can I talk a little bit about tiers
Yeah.
before we do that and just like the concept? So I think the point that David raised is an important one, which is that, right, the pros and cons of a phased approach versus an all at once approach. The biggest pro there is the number goes down, right? One of the mandates that we were asked to do on staff that we were asked to do as part of ENRC was come back to us with a number that has a 1 in front of it, right? The initial psychological barrier was 15 million. Then, when the schools came back with that large number, it became difficult to square. And so the psychological barrier became 20 million. How do we get below a $20 million override ask? And the structure of doing that is that upfront structure. And the way the other thing that does that led me to make that my primary recommendation from an operational standpoint is it cushions us in the out year. It cushions the town, and which is something that Cliff raised, right? If you do the traditional Brookline override style approach, let me show you this slide. Maybe this will help understand, kind of make sense. So if we were to do so this assumes that the town does the all at once approach still. This 23.25 million dollar override number. School, so town all at once, schools phased. So you can see here, the schools are pay as they go. Every year the override levy goes up by a certain amount, and every year the schools spend all of that money covering their services. That leaves them with $0 to balance out. If I were to extend this column out to FY30, that balance there, the amount of money that they would need to cover their deficit, would be another $6 to $7 million. So the schools would start in FY30 in the hole, and in the hole pretty significantly. And we would again be at this point where the schools would have to say, either we're going to make cuts in services or we're going to go back to the voters. And I don't know what that would look like structurally. On our end, we would be saving some of that money. We would have some of that. I think we would be okay in FY30, just back of the envelope looking at that. But there's a lot that can change between now and then. At the very least, we would have some money available that we had started, we would start to be drawing down from the stabilization fund. But we would still be able to cushion ourselves in FY30. Whereas if you look at this version, what the schools have available to them is $6 million. And it's they're starting to draw down, like the town is, on their reserves in year one. But what this means in practice is that even though that gap is ostensibly going to be larger, they're going to have more money to cover it. It's going to be less than a $6 million hole for the schools to cover in FY30. So that phantom fourth year that's lingering out there is another big concern of mine, in terms of thinking about how do we structure this in such a way that we are not then confronted with a cliff? Because what we're seeing from the schools is growth year over year that exceeds 2.5 plus.
Or getting into a pattern that's perceived as every 3 years we have a levy.
Right. So, and again, that may not, that may not be an inherently bad thing in and of itself, if that's what, from a political perspective, that's more tolerable. If you were able to say to the voters, we can do this, but you should expect that we will be coming back.
So if you're good on this.
Sorry,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. You're saying that in this scenario, the 6 million, the schools have 6 million more to play with.
Yeah.
But the levy
Yes.
itself is also higher by $4 million in the non-front loaded system in year 4. So
Yes.
where does that money get? Presumably that money can get allocated as well.
So that money is already allocated because it's pay as you go, right? This is, what, do you have a better way of explaining this than I do?
Right, so this, I'm sorry. I didn't-
Yeah, no.
First, it just shows how complicated this is.
Yes.
It's go.
But number two, it gets back to the conversation we had earlier, about, the difference between what you're calling an override and the tax levy. Because in the front loaded, the tax levy is going up. And so it's going to be higher in year 2 than first of all, it's higher in year 1 than it would be if you didn't have it all up front. It's higher in year 2 than it would be. So that extra money in year 2 is also going into the reserve fund.
Yeah.
And so, the benefit of doing, and at the end, sure, your last year, you're sort of like at the same, but because you've been stepping up, you do not have that extra for the first couple of years. And there is a benefit, for having some money in reserve but people are paying for that
Yeah.
along the way.
Does that mean that there's?
Are you actually at the same number?
You're not exactly at the same number, but you're close.
You're
Yes,
close.
it's the 18.3 versus 16.9. Are the 2% from a percentage standpoint.
So Jess, does that mean you would need three numbers on the ballot because you'd have the, let's just say scenario, you have 23 million or
Yeah.
whatever the number is.
Yeah.
Which would be the pay as you go.
Yeah.
The front loaded, which would be 18.
Yeah,
Right? And then potentially, is there another number?
yeah, there could be some lower amount.
But that's not tiers though.
I mean,
Well, it is kind
I
of,
mean, we
it's
do-
kind of
we do
tiers of
tiers.
options on tier one. Option one, tier one has two options,
Right.
pay as you go or front load.
right,
And then there could be a lower number, which is
right.
pay as you go or front load, I
Right,
guess,
right. I mean, so here I've got two different front-loaded options for what it would look like. I'm sorry, John's got his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I just recommend to everyone that they read the question that was on the ballot in 2023, and I'm gonna read it, it doesn't take very long. Shall the town of Brookline be allowed to assess an additional $11,983,367 in real estate and personal property taxes for the purposes of funding the cost of the Brookline Public Schools, and then there's a number for the schools, and funding the cost of an additional expenditures in municipal departments, and there's a number for that, and for the fiscal year beginning July 1st, 2023. Then it becomes a question at the subsequent town meeting. If the override passes, the voters have approved an override of 11,903,000. Here are the options of how we could raise that, okay? And then town meeting weighs in, this, this magic wet formula that Chaz has, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Disrespect it.
No,
no. It sounds like gimmicky, but I get that it's not really gimmicky, but it sounds kind of gimmicky. And if town meeting can be persuaded, let's borrow it all in year one, then we borrow it all in year one and maybe save ourselves some overall cost in the long run.
It's not borrow, take it is what you mean.
Huh?
You don't mean borrow, it, you mean take it.
Well, yeah, okay. Yeah,
Levy it.
levy it, excuse me, but yeah.
John, in the traditional way that the board has structured these overrides, the board has the control because you're setting the tax rate and you are determining how much excess capacity to leave on the table.
Okay,
Right.
well,
So
then
that's the distinction.
maybe
is-
that makes my
That's a good point.
point in a different way. Then it's up to the select board to decide, right? How much we levy, in the year one. And we can have that whole discussion about whether we levy it all. or we
It's a
levy
better
part of it.
discussion
Yeah.
here than
Yeah.
at town here.
But if we create a tax calculator, which would be a good idea, so
Yeah.
people can go evaluate it, you need to know how you're gonna take the money, John.
yes.
Yeah.
Right, so that you can, right, otherwise, I think we'd have to decide
There's
this.
just sort of the other challenge to John's proposal here is then you don't have a specific amount that you are asking for because that differs depending on how it will be financed. And I think having a specific amount is going to be critically important to the voters. They want to know what they're approving or not. There are differences. I do want,
Sorry.
I do want to correct an earlier statement that the approximately 5 million delta would be in the number you see when you're voting, but it's not actually 5 million in savings, it's marginal savings.
Well,
Yes, what are you gonna say to the voters as you're selling this? If you, because in the past it's been, the money's gonna be taken over 3 years, right? So are you going to be telling people that or not? Because that's really what you get back around to.
Right,
Yeah.
and I think, and what I was gonna say was that, a lot of what we talked about within the committee was around transparency to the voters, making sure we give voters a choice, and without that transparency, we don't. I don't think the committee would feel comfortable that we were giving voters a true choice.
I think that,
Great point.
Which is not to say you can educate on option two, we think that is is probably an educate, I think.
I would premise that the vast majority of voters have no idea when you're taking the money. When they do an override, they just, whether we're ramping it or not, that would be the first thing. I think it shows up when we provide a tax calculator, they can see what happens right there with their numbers, but it is a complicated issue to educate. And the other option of, instead of having two options, to say, for both numbers, we're gonna stay below 20. And we're gonna front load both as. The 18 million is front loaded, and then something lower is front loaded. And we get higher benefit from both scenarios, and we move towards that model in the future.
I thought that's, yeah. fine.
Yeah, I mean. I guess my fear, and. You know, I'll say, we have to have some override, but my fear is that in the front loaded model, there are gonna be two things that people might look at. One is what the number is. Presumably less than 20 million, but the other is the result of that calculator.
Yeah.
And if we use the front loaded option and somebody uses that calculator and says. My taxes are going up, what, this year?
Yeah.
Then the fact that 20 million, 24 million, I think is gonna be too abstract for
Capacity
them
to pay.
to be meaningful, and they're gonna base their decision on the shock that they just experienced at the past.
Well, I'm just, it sounds like you're coming around to the same place that Paul and I are in, which is we don't want to turn the question into it could be less depending on how we front load the money. I mean, well.
I don't know if he's coming, don't say what I'm.
Well, all right.
I'm not sure I understand.
Save that answer for later. In response to what David said, I mean, I think this gets at the whole point here. Are we actually going to have two different versions of what? Because the question has to be how much to increase the levy, okay?
Right.
And so we're gonna have two different versions of the answer to taxpayers as to what that will mean to you in terms of how much you're hit, in your taxes.
Here's my answer to your question. Following something Paul often says, to keep it simple, we have two different variables here. One is front loading versus not, and the other is full funding of the requests or something less. And I'm saying that mixing those two up as you're describing is too complicated, and we should just focus on no more than one of them, right? And I think that the front loading one is the one that we should jettison. We should focus on the other.
And you are serving the same place as me.
So. I agree with keeping it simple, and I do think this is really complicated. And I don't know, I lean towards keeping it simple and saying, we need 23 million, or we need 18 million, or we need 18 million and we need 14 million. We just make it simple like that. And tell them what we're gonna fund or lose if you don't get that. What are the consequences?
And so just to give you a sense to Michael's point about the real dollar value, you can see up on the screen now, this is if you structure as we traditionally do, pay as you go. You can see the median single family home, median condo, and median commercial. This is how much your taxes would go up. So you can see your taxes would go up by an additional, if you're in a single family homeowner, in FY 27 under the pay-as-you-go model, an additional $619. Now, remember, taxes are already going up quite a bit this year because of the debt exclusions and so forth. So the total tax increase with an override on top of that for a median single-family home, which remember, that's a $2.1 million valued home, is $1,681. Median condo would be $983. The median commercial would be $2,785. So over the course of the 3-year override, the taxes would go up an estimated $3,924. These are the medians. Now, if you took it up front, yeah. Make it bigger. I'll make it as big as I can.
And Melissa, this is the chart that I really wanted the numbers underneath, because the top line numbers are confusing.
So if you take it all up front, if you structured it that way and reduce the total amount, comparatively, your taxes would go up by a lot more in the first year. It would be the median single family home would see an increase of $2,231. That's versus $1,681. So it's a significant increase. It's
So for the sake of trying to give, and what you said, the two decisions is really how you look at this. There's a matrix, right? There's there's a $23 million number that gets you fully funded.
Yep.
And then there's a number that you're suggesting that we want to have a 1 in front of it to make it more palatable to the voters, right? Can we have a scenario that says pay as you go, 23 million and 18 million? And then front load, what would be the, if we front loaded 23, it would actually be 18.
Right.
What would be, if we front loaded 18, what would it be?
If you front loaded 18, so you mean if you took a cut off of 18 from the front loading perspective, right? So it would be the lower number.
Yeah, so if you had a 18 million pay as you go,
Mhm.
and instead we front loaded it, would it be 14?
Ah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so you basically said, take 18.6 as your starting point.
Yeah.
But assume pay as you go, and then think about what that would look like
As a front load.
as a front.
Because then what we could do is because we're gonna spin on this for a long time, we could say to the school committee, we know what your $23 million ask is, give us what happens at 18. And then we can have the discussion about front loading and not front loading.
But is it 18 or is it like 15 or 14?
Well, it will be lower if you front load it.
If you front load it, so that's what I'm saying is, what's the full, you see where I'm going?
Yeah,
with
I
this?
do, but I also, let me just flag for you, and then Dick Beckman's got his hand. Like, let me flag for you up front, what happens in that scenario when you front load.
Yeah.
The reason why the front loading works well at the level that it's at is because it gives you that cushion and lets you, and that's how you get that number to be lower, is that you're using one-time funds to cover expenses in the out years.
Yeah.
Once you start lowering that number, and here I'll blow this up, this is a potential front-loaded $15 million override. And it's split so the schools in town are reduced by roughly the same amount. It's roughly 86% of the 18.6 million. This gets you to 15 million. That's that psychological barrier, whatever. So that leaves the town with 4.6 million and the schools with 10.35 million. Again, everyone is reduced at the same rate.
Yeah.
You see what happens to the schools at the end of this.
They have a deficit of 1.5.
They're in the red. So this override doesn't even get them through those 3 years. They would be looking at a deficit. And then again, think back to, they would have to make cuts, and then they would be in a really rough position in in FY 30.
Jasper,
Yeah.
if you reduced it, are the expenses reduced up top?
This, no, this assumes that the schools and the town would try and do what they're doing now. So yes, theoretically, the schools could try and make reductions and that's why we need the feedback from the schools. Like, if this was the model,
So this doesn't really answer Paul's question, because if you're suggesting a reduction to 18.
Yep.
Then you'd be assuming that they're gonna be reducing costs.
Yeah, they'd have to cut costs. We're not
So
gonna.
that's not part of this.
not yet. So yeah, we can come back on that. We'll figure that out. So Dick has raised his hand and Val has raised her hand.
Right, Dick?
Thank you. Could you go to the slide, please, where you had the 2231 figure?
Yeah.
I just wanted to make clear that those are looking at tax increases from year to year. So in fiscal year 27, there'd be a 2231 increase as opposed to fiscal year 26. Another 690 above and beyond that in fiscal year 27. If you're comparing it to this year, you would have a $2,800 or $2,900 increase relative to where we are this year. It's not just that it's going up by the 690, but that 2231 is embedded or would be embedded in the fiscal year 28 increase.
Right.
So when that final figure at the end,
yeah,
in a sense, is understated by 2231 plus in each year going forward.
Well,
Go ahead.
That is the real impact that people will see. That being said, I do want to point out that a large part of this is an increase that's already embedded in the tax burden that people are going to be paying through even if there is no override.
Right.
Because
So, yeah, I'm sorry, Dick, finish. I thought you were going to apologize.
just because of the 2.5% increase from year to year, and also because of the amounts of
Debt exclusion.
Like, and that is what
that
these
we've
two
already,
that's actually what these numbers are, right? You can see if you front load the override, then the amount that goes up due to the override in future years is 0%. But your taxes are still going up because you have 2.5 and debt exclusions and new growth.
and the debt exclusions, yeah. But
That's right.
my point is that
3,600 is the full number. Dick, that will be the full impact of the median single family home for the, yeah, so that's what they will pay incrementally over the course of that 3 years. So if they're paying 10,000 today at the end, which, it's not the base, but it'll be 13,600 in
Okay.
2029.
David, quick, but
Yeah,
then Val.
Just a quick question I have. So looking at this holistically, including the debt exclusion increases that are already built in, it looks like over 3 years, the increase in taxes for the medium value home would be about $6,000. So would it be fair to get an understanding of what that average bill would be per month? Divide that by 36, you get about $167.
I think your first number is wrong. I think that 6,000 number is wrong.
Yeah, the six, again, right, so I could restructure this to Dick's point and show you what the cumulative increase looks like, but this is the cumulative increase over 3 years.
Okay, let's hear from Valerie. Val?
You're muted, Val.
Well, we'll try and promote her, sorry, Val, 1 second.
She is.
Oh, you're promoted, you should be able to unmute.
So if we're waiting for valid, I wanted to chime in on one more thing that I think is relevant,
Yeah, go ahead.
which is that option one actually is still front loaded from the town point of view.
Right.
Okay, so, and that's why if you look at the charts that I included in my slide presentation, and, maybe we can pull those up. There is a line that actually shows the stabilization fund on the town side. It's a green line that shows you pay into it and then you run it down.
Yeah.
So going back to the question around education, there might need to be some education regardless. Even if you choose option one, that I think based on the conversation that I heard, I thought was important to point out because it does throw a wrench in that particular conversation. And also the reason we did not include the full, more traditional ramp was that number was just shy of $26 million.
I have it up now, it's 25.89.
That's right.
The town's number goes up to 7.95 if you do pay as you go on the town side.
Valerie?
Thank you. I apologize. I had to drop off in the middle for a bit, so if this was raised, apologies, but I think this goes to what Cliff was maybe alluding to. I don't think that we save a lot above the line, at least on the school side, with a lower number, because we would see such an increase in unemployment costs, and we bear those 100% as a town. And I know that Ann's here and others are here who can correct me, but I believe that Melissa's calculation is that in fact, we would end up paying more in unemployment than for benefits. So I just wanted to make sure that that was understood. And on the school side, we've also cut our non-salary expense to a percent that no other school district in our peer community has. It's so low at this point. So there's no more to cut there. So it really is just people.
Okay, David?
I'm sure if I can get back to my question for a moment, I think that a lot of voters will look at this as what will be their increase on average per month, because it usually gets folded into mortgage payments. And so to have some idea of what is that figure for the median home, what would be the monthly increase over 3 years?
We can do that. It wouldn't be level, right? It would be. And I think in the upfront version, it might be disingenuous because it would look low, but in fact, the first year it would really ramp up quite heavily. So, but we can do that.
Yes.
Okay, John.
So having raised the example of the question that was put on the ballot in 2023, there's some, I do recommend everybody sort of go back and look at that, the way that was done. The other interesting thing about what happened in 2023 was there were actually two options.
That's right.
For overrides, amounts. And the first one was what I recited. The second one was, the first one plus an additional amount, which had to do with, I think, adoption of a pay-as-you-throw, or, maybe Chaz or composting, yeah, exactly. The first one passed and the second one didn't. And it was made clear that, in the event that that one passes, the other one doesn't, the higher amount will prevail. I think we have to have some way of structuring this, that people clearly understand that, they can choose a high amount, or they can choose something other than a high amount. But we don't want to put people in the position of, those are your only choices. And we don't want to put them in the position of, if it turns out that a majority of you did not want the highest amount, unfortunately, your vote was divided when it came to the lower amounts. And so the higher amount actually had the most votes, even though the majority of you wanted something lower than the highest amount. That feels a little bit like, I'll throw the word bundling in, which people who remember the campaign for the Driscoll School, which was bundled with a school project of about $100 million, that it turns out a majority of the people in town didn't want. But the only way they could express that was to vote against that and vote against Driscoll, which they wanted. So we can't be putting people in the position of, facing a question where they lose, even if they're in the majority who did not choose the highest amount. And I don't have the perfect answer as to how we do that, but I think we have to do it.
Okay, in terms of preparing for next week's meeting, where we should have some general ideas of where we want to go, and finalize them in the third meeting. What can you
So
provide?
I have a concrete ask from Paul, which is, he wants to know if we were to structure 18.6 as pay as you go, what would that look, what cuts would we have to make? How would that look? So we would look at the schools and town number on that and try and figure that out. I could get that number to the school committee and school department, and they would look at what that would mean as a practical matter in terms of cuts, as would we. We can,
The ballot question.
yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and it was a suggestion. I mean,
Right, yeah,
I'm like, let's see what the group
Yeah,
thinks, but
yeah.
that's,
But I think, you're right, you gotta start.
you gotta give a
start
number.
somewhere,
You
right.
gotta start with a
You gotta
number.
start somewhere, and I think that's as good a place as any to start. I think, the school committee will come back and, I think, to Val's point, cuts there are gonna be pretty dire, but we can see what that looks like. Yeah,
So are we supposed to give them a number to cut to today?
we would like, or some kind of rubric, right? For example, John had in the past floated this idea of what does this look like if it only goes up by a certain percentage? What does it look like if it only goes up by a certain dollar amount? So you have, again, the full amount, and then you have something less. The question is, what rubric do you use to determine what that something less is? Paul has suggested one. Another might be, right, what's a flat 10%? I have that number here. What's a flat 10% look like? The answer is, if you took it up front, we could do it. It would just leave us in the hole, badly in the hole in FY30. If we front loaded 16.3, which is 10%, a 10% haircut. We could do something similar for the pay as you go. We could take a 10% off of that. The cuts would be more significant, obviously, but and it wouldn't get you below 20 million. It would get you close.
And then I'd also appreciate that per month increase approach, because I think that makes it more meaningful to voters. And if they see that the difference is relatively small between the monthly increases, that might make them more amenable to a higher amount, or maybe not, but at least they would know and be more informed. Because discussing the question in this manner, it's still very abstract.
Can we throw this out? Can we agree that the second tier would be 10% of whatever the top tier is. And I just want to get some number that they can work with.
We can pull that.
Okay, but is that agreeable to other people?
Is it, agree what?
So 10% less than the 23 million if we
Right.
don't do front loading or if we do.
So what's 10?
So 10%, 90% of the $23 million number, hold on. It's easy enough to do.
Or yeah,
Spell magic.
Or more.
It's 20.9 million.
So it's not, doesn't have a one in front of it.
Well, what would be a percentage to make it 19?
19.
There you go.
I mean, psychologically, it has an impact.
That's it.
There you go, 86%.
86%.
19.9998.
Okay, can we agree that that is the number that we start with?
And we're asking both the town and the schools to split that?
We'll split it proportionally.
So, that's the high number, Bernard, is it you're talking about?
No, that's the low, so the second tier, the high number is 24 or 23.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe two numbers, 23 and then 19.
Yeah.
So
And we'll do the same
I had my
exercise
hand
up front.
I had my hand up.
the other thing that I would ask for, Chaz, you talked about this psychological barrier of a number with a one in front of it and a number with a two. I mean, I'm not convinced that that is the number that is psychologically impactful. So it would be helpful for this group to have some backup on why. I mean, that might be psychological within the building or outside the building or with some groups and others, and I would just like to know the basis of that.
We get a psychologist to come in and advise us.
It's actually, it's more.
Whoever came up with that, are you a psychologist?
It's more a question of voting.
I think,
not
you know.
psychology.
David.
So to that point, Michael, I don't know how we would be able to have a definitive response to your question there and why psychologically it would be better to have a one in front. At least to me intuitively, given that there has never been a ballot question in excess of 14.8 million in Arlington, and that was recent. It's a tall order, I think, to be saying, well, we want 20 something. And so that's why I think keeping it in the teens, that would be in keeping with what other communities have done. There is precedent for in the teens, there isn't for 20 plus.
Yeah, it's just a guess, but you know,
Right.
But we are a population of 63,000 people, and Arlington is not, and Stoughton is not, and Melrose is not. So that's why I think individuals' experiences may not respond to what that number is, because there's no denominator.
yeah, John.
Well, and that discussion is important, and I think that, if I remember correctly, the, report goes into some pretty good analysis of, what are the comparatives? And so it shouldn't just be the whole, the number, the raw number. It should also be, determined on the basis of the, per population, et cetera, per person. The number we're talking about, whether it's the raw number, or not the raw number, per capita number, it's still way high. I mean, it still puts us in kind of an unusual category.
Yeah.
But the other, excuse me, the point I want to make is, I may have been understood, I heard you quote, and I think, with good intentions, but maybe not accurately. Well, I did raise a 10% number, but if I'm remembering, the context correctly, it was, we should be looking at this from the perspective of the impact on, property tax payers and the 3-year impact. And I may have said something like, maybe the 3-year impact should be our guidepost, and maybe it should be something on the order of 10% increase, which would be about 3.5% a year over 3 years. And I think our lowest low number has got to be predicated on, it factoring in that whole question of taxpayer capacity to pay these increases. We're in a pretty high category already. And whatever else we do, I hope that when we explain to people what we're asking them for, we make sure to say, as you have said, your taxes are already going to go up X% next year.
Yep.
And they're already going to go up X% cumulatively over 3 years. And what we are asking you for is that they go up X% plus this, in 1 year, and X% plus this over 3 years. And then they can really figure out, where they stand and, and we can figure out what is the willingness of people when it comes to watching their taxes go up every year, year after year. Maybe they're okay with it going up 3.5% every year. And maybe that's the problem with 2.5, is that we need the money, it is the equivalent of 3.5, and people are actually willing to give us 3.5. But they need to have some number offered, which is when we finish paying off this and when we finish paying off the unfunded, pension gap, and then when we begin paying off the unfunded OPEB gap, your taxes, generally speaking, year after year, will go up around 3.5% a year, as long as we are really careful with our negotiated contracts. And as long as we don't get slammed with some sort of huge fixed cost increase out of nowhere. That's the kind of reassurance, that I think people want to hear and would make them willing, not just this year, but in future years, to sustain like a 3.5% per year increase over time, year after year, ask after ask.
So Bernard, thanks, Bernard. There's one piece that you're missing from the puzzle.
Maybe.
Which is the consequence of not funding a certain level, right?
Mhm.
So, losing 6 police positions, closing or losing a fire truck, a company, or maybe a station. On the school side, I consider a decimation of our public education in Brookline. So you're purely taking it from a budgetary standpoint, which I appreciate. People, I think we need to provide the information so people understand what their taxes are gonna go up, but they need to clearly understand what the consequences are of not funding it.
Right.
Well, I would say also the consequences of not being very, very tight when we negotiate contracts, so that we don't push ourselves into these kinds of situations.
David?
So I agree with Paul's proposal with respect to having a firm understanding of the consequences of each level. To Michael's earlier point, I appreciate what you're saying about the population differences. I was not making my remark about 19 versus 20 on the basis of trying to insinuate that I would not support having the 23 as an option. Just for the exercise of having a reduced number, what I think the reduced number should be. I don't really see 23 and 20 as big of a difference as 23 and 19. And if the point of the exercise is to see what cuts would look like, to Paul's point, for a lower figure, I think that the 19 amount is a better target. But I definitely appreciate what you're saying. And clearly, if we do Paul's exercise to completion to show those differences between 23 and 19, the public needs to be aware that at 19, you're losing a lot. And what specifically are you losing? And the schools would have a week to put that together, which is a big ask, but we need it.
And to be clear, that 19 would be a non-front loaded 19.
Right.
On the school side.
On the school side.
For the whole thing.
For the whole thing.
If you want it for the whole thing.
No,
Just the school.
Just the
Okay,
schools.
but then we could also see what, if you did front load it.
Yep.
That number would probably go down,
Yes.
right? Okay.
John?
If I may, Sadaka, and maybe any other members of the ERSC who are listening. Did the ERSC take a position, because they did a lot of analysis of tax capacity, the average taxpayer's capacity to pay, these increases. Did they take a position on what is a reasonable expectation for the town to set in terms of the capacity of taxpayers to say yes to an override insofar as the burden that it would put them under, and rent payers as well? Did the ERSC take a position on that?
We didn't take a position on it. The work that was done on this topic is what was summarized by Dick, was on the call, and can probably reiterate some of the work that he did. There's a lot of great data in there. But I think in order to really answer that question, we would have had to have done, a different kind of research and a different kind of survey.
But you quantified it. I mean, you quantified
What Dick quantified was the increases that have happened and where they exceed that sort of 30% rules
Right.
about threshold around
Right.
cost of living for which populations, in different categories, which is different from what I understood your question to be.
Okay, Susan Gibbons has her hand up.
Yeah, okay.
Are you finished?
Well, I didn't know if Dick wanted to comment on that question, because he did the work on it.
Yeah, I understand. Susan?
I just want to make sure that I'm clear because this is a really tight turnaround. So am I understanding this, that it's reducing the overall override down to 19, whatever, proportionally between the town and the school? You're not asking the school to take that entire cut.
Yeah, it'd be proportional is what they're asking, in my understanding.
So we need to give them the number that.
Yes, I'm working on, I'm working on it now, Susan. I'm trying to get to the, what that
Yeah,
would
I
look like.
just want to make sure that I'm clear because a lot to be done in a very short turnaround and I don't want to have a mess here.
And what we would get back is at that level, what would the things that the schools would say they would cut? Like, what would be the impact?
What are
And
the
also-
reductions? Correct. Yep.
What are the
I
reductions?
understand
Yeah.
that.
You already know what a no override budget would look like, or cuts would look like. In a certain sense, it's, that plus what you can get back with just 19 million. Yeah. go ahead.
I'm wondering whether the committee or any part of it did, either did some research or ended up taking a position within the economic development conversation. What would be an appropriate amount of new growth over time? Right now, we have it estimated, I think, at 2.5 million a year. And obviously, any dollar that comes in through new growth doesn't affect the override.
So the answer is no. New growth is, it's one of those things that, you really cannot predict. Maybe you can predict, to some degree, the types of, increases you might get from new growth of people doing renovations to their homes or new single family, or multifamily construction, but major projects, you cannot predict those at all.
And we have had the experience of building that into overrides and then having the assumptions be wrong in timing.
Yeah.
And then we've had to kind of recalibrate.
Sure.
Well, we don't do it.
The reason I ask that is not because first of all, I appreciate that problem. The reason I'm asking that is because there's a whole bunch of discussion, whether it's within the roadmap, the comprehensive plan, or your economic development recommendations, that the select board either takes some action or facilitates some action, right, with regard to economic development. And I'm just trying to get a sense of the scale of that effort in terms of like what you think we should be trying to hold ourselves accountable to. I mean, continuing to be conservative in our budgeting, but just in terms of that level of effort, so that.
A couple of things. First, remember, that was part of the future subcommittee. And it does not assume that anything would be available for the next 3 years. Okay, that's good. I think broadly to your other question, that really is something that the committee wasn't charged to do. And at the end of the day, that is where the community discussion comes in. And I think it would have been inappropriate for this group, a small group, to essentially make a recommendation about certain aspects that really are going to be come out of community discussions. So much as I personally would, my vision, but that's.
Do you think that for example, the chair of the comprehensive plan might be able to answer that question?
Look, if I were.
And I'm only saying that it's out of the room.
Look, if I were in your shoes, I'd say we need to wait for the comprehensive plan to be finished.
Okay.
And maybe that will give you a better idea. But you can get a comprehensive plan, we've had them before, and they haven't really done much because it's the question of implementing the recommendations, going through those zoning changes, and once you've got that stuff in place, I think you'll have a better sense, and you're gonna get the type of feedback you might want from organizations that would be looking to develop.
So Paul, just to bring you up to speed,
Did I get committed to something?
I'm sorry?
Did I get it to do?
Yeah, yes, you did. I had a question about new growth and
Yeah.
they didn't take it on. But we talked about that in terms of the comprehensive
Yeah.
plan. So I'm just wondering whether in the context of the work that's being done by the
Yeah.
comprehensive plan, whether any sort of target or accountability metrics around expected new growth over the period of the comprehensive plan is part of that, part of the discussion.
I don't think it's down to a number yet, Michael.
Mhm.
And I think that would have to be maybe a next round of work, but I do want to emphasize what Cliff was saying, that quick, transitioning the comp plan into execution so it doesn't become shelfware. I think we need to now whether we can jump right to, I don't think we'd be able to jump right into comprehensive zoning reform. But I do think you could quickly move into, based on the feedback we got from the community, where the prioritization areas are for growth. And then you could start doing that additional work to start to, do further studies, I hate to say, but to do that.
Let's try to wrap this up.
Yeah. I think maybe Dick Banker wants to comment on the question I asked. No,
No.
okay, you don't. I keep seeing you on the screen and I thought maybe that's what.
Yeah, why are you on the screen, Dick? You're pinned. Someone has pinned you.
Can I? I
Yeah.
wanna come back to Michael's question originally, which is, what do you guys do about asking questions? If you have questions you want to submit, I would suggest one or two things, either funnel them to Bernard and have him, distribute, or Sadaf and I, can take them and distribute, whatever. I think that's really up to you how you want to handle that process, but
I think the more organized and effective approach would be to funnel them to me. I'll work with Chaz and work it to you. And so I'd like to wrap this up. We're gonna have a working lunch so that we get the next item in our agenda completed. Really appreciate the presentation, very thorough, very informative. And also shows the complexity of what we have to do. Well,
I just want to
thank you.
thank the committee and all of you guys in particular, everyone who presented here. You just did a huge amount of work for more than a year. It was a really remarkable undertaking and the result is excellent. And we're just very grateful for it's volunteer work, as we joked when we were exchanging emails late at night, we get paid for this, you don't. So thank you very much.
It's a lot clearer than I think past override studies have been. Easier to read.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah.
great.
So-
And the staff support was great,
Yeah.
so.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much.
Okay. Take a break, maybe 10 minutes.
Get our food.
To get our food and do other things.
We have sounds and racks, and